Hey everybody. This is Sleep Crime, and today I'm going to help you out. I know you want to fall asleep to this video. So before you do, put a like and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you from and what time is it? Make yourself comfortable and relax. The quiet neighborhood of Midwest City, Oklahoma, settled into its usual routine as the sun set on May 13, 1997. The night air was still and uneventful in the 11600 block of Southeast 15th Street, where 7-year-old Kirsten Hatfield lived with her mother and sister. Their small rental home, like others along the street, had a sense of modest familiarity. It was in this setting that events would soon unfold to shatter a family and leave a community grasping for answers. Around 11:30 p.m., Kirsten's mother checked on her daughters before going to bed. Kirsten was asleep in her bed, sharing a room with her younger sister. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But when the mother awoke the next morning around 6 a.m., she found Kirsten missing. The bedroom window was slightly ajar, the screen torn. A sense of panic set in immediately. She frantically searched the house and yard. There was no sign of the child. Then came a discovery that confirmed her worst fears. A pair of Kirsten's underwear was found outside, stained with blood. It lay in the backyard near the window, a chilling indicator that something violent may have occurred during the night. The mother called 911, and within minutes, Midwest City police officers arrived at the scene. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood, speaking with neighbors and conducting a door-to-door search. They found that the window to Kirsten's bedroom was not only damaged but showed evidence it had been forced open. The immediate area around the window appeared to have been disturbed, with grass trampled and a few footprints visible in the dirt. The crime scene suggested someone had entered the room from outside, possibly while the family slept, and abducted the child without being heard. The search intensified throughout the day, involving local volunteers, law enforcement, and later, the FBI. Canine units combed the area. Helicopters scanned nearby fields. Volunteers distributed flyers and set up search parties across the city. Despite the massive effort, no trace of Kirsten was found beyond what had been discovered that morning. There were no signs of a struggle inside the room, and her younger sister had slept through the night, unaware of the intrusion. Detectives worked swiftly to determine who might have targeted the family. Interviews began with anyone who had contact with Kirsten or her family. Friends, acquaintances, and neighbors were asked about suspicious activity or anything out of the ordinary. Among those questioned was a man named Anthony Palma, who lived just 2 doors down. Palma, a then 35-year-old mechanic, had no known connection to the Hatfields but was included in the routine neighborhood canvassing. At the time, there was no evidence tying him to the case, and his name, like many others, faded into the background of the initial investigation. The community response was immediate and profound. Posters of Kirsten's face lined storefronts and telephone poles. Media coverage drew attention to her disappearance, making it a high-profile case in Oklahoma and beyond. Days turned into weeks, and then months, but there were no confirmed sightings, no ransom demands, and no solid leads. Investigators maintained that the blood found on Kirsten's underwear outside her window indicated a violent encounter, but without a body or direct witness, the case remained unresolved. Kirsten Hatfield was officially listed as a missing person, and the investigation into her abduction continued with no definitive conclusion. Her mother and sister remained in the home for a time before eventually relocating, unable to continue living in the place where the unimaginable had occurred. The bedroom window, once a portal to the ordinary childhood of a 7-year-old girl, had become the point of entry into one of Oklahoma's most disturbing unsolved cases. In the hours and days following Kirsten Hatfield's disappearance, the Midwest City Police Department launched an intensive investigation. The early focus was clear: recover Kirsten as quickly as possible and identify whoever had entered the home that night. The crime scene offered a few initial clues, but many more questions than answers. The torn window screen was carefully collected, and forensic experts examined it for signs of tool marks or biological material. Investigators photographed the bedroom, measured the footprint impressions near the window, and preserved the blood-stained underwear found outside. They noted that there was no forced entry at the door, no obvious signs of a struggle inside the room. It was as if Kirsten had been taken in silence, plucked from her bed in the middle of the night. Detectives initiated interviews with anyone who might have seen or heard anything suspicious. They canvassed the neighborhood extensively, questioning neighbors multiple times over the following days. One of those neighbors was Anthony Palma, a resident who lived just a few doors away. Palma told investigators he had been home asleep that night and had not seen or heard anything unusual. At the time, his statements did not raise significant suspicion. He had no known history of violent crime and maintained a low profile within the community. FBI agents were brought in to assist, lending their expertise in child abduction cases. They helped develop a behavioral profile of a potential suspect, focusing on individuals who might have had knowledge of the family's routines or access to the property. Law enforcement looked at registered sex offenders in the area and tracked down anyone with a history of violence or predatory behavior. Despite the broad scope of the investigation, the forensic technology of the time placed limits on how much could be extracted from the evidence. The blood on Kirsten's underwear was tested, but DNA techniques in 1997 were in their relative infancy. The sample did not yield a usable profile, and there were no matches in existing databases. The partial prints and other trace evidence did not conclusively point to a suspect. Tips came in from across the state and beyond. Callers claimed to have seen a girl matching Kirsten's description at stores, in parks, even in other states. Each lead was investigated, but none led to a breakthrough. Authorities faced the painful reality of a case with no clear direction. Flyers and news coverage continued, but as time passed, the flow of new information slowed. The investigation, while still active, began to lose its momentum. Midwest City officers returned to interview some of the same individuals multiple times, hoping new insights or changing stories might lead to progress. Anthony Palma was interviewed again but remained consistent in his statements. No physical evidence connected him to the disappearance. The investigation had not excluded him or anyone else, but without something concrete, detectives could not move forward with charges against any particular suspect. Meanwhile, the Hatfield family remained in the public eye, appealing for help and updates. The community held vigils and fundraisers, distributing thousands of flyers bearing Kirsten's image. Local businesses contributed to a reward fund, hoping the incentive might encourage someone to come forward. Despite these efforts, Kirsten remained missing, and no one had been arrested. As weeks turned into months, the police department began shifting resources, although the case never closed. Investigators continued to follow up on every tip and periodically re-interviewed individuals associated with the case. But without new evidence or technological breakthroughs, the momentum slowed. What had started as a frenzied search for a missing child had turned into a painstaking wait for a lead that could reignite the investigation. By the end of 1997, Kirsten Hatfield's case had transitioned into the most difficult phase for any law enforcement agency, a cold case. The investigation remained open, files were preserved, and the evidence was stored with the hope that time or technology might one day provide the answers that had eluded them. Kirsten's disappearance haunted not only her family, but also the investigators who had dedicated months trying to find her. The neighborhood returned to quiet, but the sense of unresolved trauma lingered. A 7-year-old girl had vanished from her bedroom, and no one yet knew how or why. In the months and years that followed Kirsten Hatfield's disappearance, the investigation remained officially active, but leads grew increasingly scarce. Despite ongoing community awareness and intermittent media attention, no new breakthroughs emerged. With no suspect in custody, no sightings of the missing child, and no forensic match from the evidence collected at the scene, the case grew colder. Detectives periodically reviewed the files, retraced steps, and revisited previously interviewed individuals. Evidence from the scene remained in storage, including the blood-stained underwear and the torn window screen. While forensic science continued to evolve, technology in the late 1990s and early 2000s still lacked the sophistication to extract detailed DNA profiles from compromised or degraded samples like those recovered in 1997. The passage of time weighed heavily on the Hatfield family. Kirsten's mother made public appeals over the years, appearing in media interviews to keep attention on the case. Each anniversary brought renewed community interest, brief spikes in coverage, and occasional new tips, but none that advanced the case. The emotional toll on the family, particularly Kirsten's younger sister who had shared the bedroom on the night of the abduction, was immeasurable. Law enforcement faced growing frustration. Investigators who had worked the original case remained haunted by the lack of resolution. Some had since retired or moved to different departments, but the memory of the missing child persisted. Midwest City Police preserved the case materials meticulously, holding out hope that future developments in forensic science might provide the missing link. Community efforts to maintain awareness continued intermittently. Local news outlets ran updates on anniversaries. Kirsten's image remained etched into the collective memory of the city, especially among those who had lived through the intense search efforts. Schoolmates grew older and moved on, but many retained memories of their lost classmate. Her name became symbolic of unresolved trauma and the need for vigilance in protecting children. Despite the lack of progress, the case never closed. Law enforcement maintained the status of an open missing person and abduction investigation. The collected evidence, while limited, was preserved for future re-examination. It remained a priority for the department, even as new cases arose and resources were stretched thin. The haunting image of a 7-year-old girl taken from her bed without a trace continued to resonate. As forensic technology evolved, particularly in DNA analysis, there was growing hope among detectives that cold cases like Kirsten's might eventually be solved. By the early 2010s, DNA methods had advanced significantly, allowing law enforcement agencies to revisit old evidence with more sophisticated tools. Nationwide databases expanded, and new systems for matching crime scene DNA against convicted offenders increased the likelihood of connecting past crimes to known individuals. The turning point had not yet arrived, but change was on the horizon. Years of silence had not erased the memory of Kirsten Hatfield from the minds of investigators or her family. As they waited, the community held on to the hope that answers might still come, even after decades of uncertainty. By 2015, nearly 2 decades had passed since Kirsten Hatfield's disappearance. Advances in forensic science, particularly in DNA profiling, had revolutionized the capabilities of investigators. Across the country, police departments were revisiting old cases with fresh eyes and new technology. The Midwest City Police Department, determined not to let the case remain unsolved, requested a re-examination of the evidence collected in 1997. Among the items preserved were the blood-stained underwear found outside the Hatfield home and other trace evidence collected near the bedroom window. Using modern DNA extraction and amplification methods, forensic experts reprocessed the samples. This time, they succeeded in generating a usable male DNA profile, something that had not been possible in the earlier years due to technical limitations. The profile was entered into the National DNA Database. Weeks later, a match came back. The DNA belonged to Anthony Palma, the The same man who had been interviewed in the immediate aftermath of the abduction, and who still lived in the same house just 2 doors down from where Kirsten had disappeared. Palma's DNA had entered the system following a separate incident, and it now provided investigators with a direct forensic link to the evidence recovered from the scene. This development immediately shifted the case from a dormant file to an active investigation. Detectives reviewed Palma's history and reassessed his interviews from 1997. They looked into his background, searching for any patterns of behavior that might align with the abduction. What they found raised serious concerns. Palma had no significant criminal record, but the proximity to the crime scene and the new DNA match made him the prime suspect. Investigators began covert surveillance and sought to confirm the DNA results through additional sampling. They obtained a discarded item from Palma to conduct a secondary analysis. The results confirmed the original findings. The male DNA present on Kirsten's underwear matched Anthony Palma. With this forensic evidence in hand, detectives secured a warrant and moved to arrest him. The case that had lingered unresolved for 18 years had finally produced a critical breakthrough. The weight of the discovery was not lost on law enforcement. It was the first solid link between a suspect and the evidence found on the night of Kirsten's disappearance. In October 2015, law enforcement executed the warrant. Palma was taken into custody at his home without incident. Officers searched the residence extensively, looking for any additional evidence related to Kirsten or signs that could help determine her fate. Items were seized for forensic analysis, and investigators searched the property thoroughly, including the backyard and storage areas. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Many residents remembered the initial case and were stunned to learn that the suspect had lived in the same neighborhood for all these years. For Kirsten's family, the development brought a mix of emotions: relief that progress had finally been made, but renewed pain at the resurfacing of the trauma. Police held a press conference to announce the arrest, providing minimal details while emphasizing the role that advancements in forensic science had played in solving a case that had confounded them for nearly 2 decades. For investigators, it was a vindication of the decision to preserve evidence meticulously and a reminder of how critical DNA technology had become in resolving cold cases. Still, one major question remained: what had happened to Kirsten Hatfield? The DNA evidence linked Palma to her disappearance, but her body had never been found. Detectives hoped further questioning, searches, or evidence would lead to the discovery of her remains. The legal process was about to begin, and with it came a renewed focus on obtaining justice for a child who had vanished without a trace. On October 12, 2015, Anthony Palma was arrested at his home in Midwest City. The house, a modest structure just 2 doors down from where Kirsten Hatfield had vanished 18 years earlier, became the focus of intense police scrutiny. For nearly 2 decades, Palma had remained in the same neighborhood, living quietly, never having moved away from the scene of the abduction. Following the arrest, Palma was charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping in connection to Kirsten's disappearance. Authorities announced that the DNA evidence recovered from the underwear found in the Hatfield backyard in 1997 matched his profile. It was the key piece that linked Palma to the crime. In court documents, prosecutors argued that the presence of Palma's DNA on that evidence could not be explained by casual contact. The implication was clear: he had been present during the abduction. Searches of Palma's home began immediately. Investigators combed through every room, removed sections of flooring, examined walls, and dug through the backyard, seeking any trace of Kirsten or clues to her fate. Cadaver dogs were brought in to assist in the search. However, no human remains were found on the property. Palma, 56 at the time, was denied bond and remained in custody. In early court hearings, he appeared calm, often silent. He entered a plea of not guilty. His defense counsel argued that there was no physical evidence tying him to Kirsten beyond the DNA, and they emphasized that no body had been recovered. Nonetheless, prosecutors maintained that the DNA evidence was overwhelming. The arrest brought a surge of public and media interest back to the case. Reporters revisited the details of the 1997 disappearance. Community members expressed disbelief that Palma had lived undetected for so long within walking distance of the victim's home. Many neighbors recalled that Palma had not stood out over the years. He had lived a relatively private life, kept to himself, and had no prior arrests that drew attention. For Kirsten's family, the news marked a shift in the long-standing narrative. After years of silence, there was now a name, a face, and formal charges. Her mother expressed a mix of pain and cautious hope. While the arrest provided validation that the case had never been forgotten, it also reopened wounds that had barely begun to scar over. In the weeks following Palma's arrest, court documents revealed additional findings. Investigators stated that the location of the DNA on the underwear, combined with the timeline and Palma's proximity, eliminated the possibility of innocent transfer. Furthermore, they detailed how Palma had failed to report any involvement or provide explanations when previously interviewed in 1997, despite living so close to the scene. The arrest reignited efforts to uncover what had happened to Kirsten's remains. Authorities again searched nearby fields, vacant lots, and wooded areas. Appeals to the public were renewed, requesting any information that could help locate her body. Billboards with Kirsten's face and hotline numbers reappeared along highways. While the case had taken a significant step forward with the arrest and charges, it was still incomplete. The absence of a body meant prosecutors had to build a case on forensic evidence alone. They continued gathering witness statements, expert testimony, and background information to prepare for a trial that would revisit a tragedy nearly 2 decades old. Anthony Palma's arrest did not close the chapter on Kirsten Hatfield's story, but it brought her one step closer to justice. For law enforcement, it affirmed the value of perseverance. For the community, it was a stark reminder of how long the shadows of violence can linger in plain sight. In the months following Anthony Palma's arrest, preparations began for a high-profile trial. The charges, first-degree murder and kidnapping, were based primarily on the forensic evidence obtained during the renewed investigation in 2015. The prosecution faced the challenge of trying a case nearly 2 decades old, with no eyewitnesses and no recovered remains. Pre-trial hearings addressed key procedural matters. Palma's defense team argued for the exclusion of certain evidence, raising questions about the chain of custody and the integrity of samples stored since 1997. Prosecutors responded by detailing how the materials had been preserved and authenticated under proper protocols. The court allowed the DNA evidence to be admitted, emphasizing its relevance and scientific reliability. Jury selection was meticulous. Potential jurors were questioned about their knowledge of the case, their views on forensic evidence, and their capacity to judge a case in which the victim's body had not been found. After a careful process, a panel was selected, and the trial began in late 2017. The prosecution opened by establishing a timeline of events beginning on the night of May 13, 1997. They described the discovery of the torn window screen, the blood-stained underwear found in the backyard, and the immediate efforts made by police to find the missing child. Prosecutors emphasized that the only male DNA found on that key piece of evidence matched Anthony Palma, whose home was just feet away from Kirsten's bedroom window. Expert witnesses from forensic laboratories testified about the DNA testing process. They explained how improvements in technology had allowed for a profile to be developed from the evidence, and detailed the steps taken to confirm the results. The match to Palma's DNA was described as conclusive, with a statistical probability that made any other source highly unlikely. Witnesses included law enforcement officers who had worked on the original investigation and those who participated in the 2015 review. They recounted the interviews conducted in the days following Kirsten's disappearance, including Palma's original statement. Prosecutors highlighted that Palma had denied involvement and claimed no knowledge of the crime, despite living 2 doors down. Palma's defense centered on the absence of a body and the lack of direct evidence placing him in the Hatfield home. They argued that the DNA match, while significant, did not prove a murder had occurred, nor did it definitively place Palma at the scene at the time of the abduction. The defense questioned the reliability of decades-old evidence and the potential for contamination or error. Despite these arguments, the prosecution countered by showing the specific location and nature of the DNA evidence. Forensic experts testified that the DNA was located in a manner that ruled out innocent transfer. Moreover, investigators testified that no plausible explanation had been offered by Palma for how his DNA came to be on the evidence recovered immediately after Kirsten's disappearance. The emotional impact of the trial was felt throughout the courtroom. Members of Kirsten's family attended daily, listening to testimony that reopened old wounds. Photographs of Kirsten were shown during opening statements, and references to her childhood, her disappearance, and the years that followed evoked strong reactions from observers. As the trial progressed, the jury heard arguments that focused on circumstantial evidence, but with a compelling forensic anchor. While no eyewitness had seen Palma abduct Kirsten, and no confession had been obtained, the prosecution argued that the totality of evidence pointed to him as the only viable suspect. The trial concluded with closing arguments that framed the choice before the jury as one between scientific certainty and speculative doubt. The prosecution maintained that the DNA evidence, coupled with the timeline and Palma's proximity, left no reasonable alternative. The defense urged jurors to focus on the gaps in the narrative, the missing body, the passage of time, and the circumstantial nature of the case. After deliberating, the jury reached a verdict. Anthony Palma was found guilty on both counts. The decision marked a turning point in the long-unsolved case of Kirsten Hatfield, delivering a legal resolution after 20 years of uncertainty. Following the guilty verdict in 2017, the courtroom remained tense as the sentencing phase began. The jury, having unanimously convicted Anthony Palma of the kidnapping and murder of Kirsten Hatfield, was now tasked with determining the appropriate punishment. Prosecutors sought life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, citing the nature of the crime and the enduring impact on the victim's family. Victim impact statements were presented in court. Kirsten's mother addressed the judge and jury, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She spoke of the enduring pain her family had carried since the night her daughter disappeared, and how each year that passed without answers had deepened the loss. She described Kirsten as a bright, caring child whose life had been taken far too soon, and how her absence continued to affect those who loved her. Prosecutors highlighted the calculated nature of the crime. They pointed to Palma's decision to target a child sleeping in her own home, the effort to abduct her undetected, and the years he spent living near the scene while evading suspicion. They emphasized the trust violated within the neighborhood, where children had once played freely and families believed they were safe. The DNA evidence, they argued, made it impossible to consider Palma's actions as anything but deliberate and violent. The defense, acknowledging the jury's verdict, requested a sentence that allowed for parole. They reiterated that the prosecution had not proven how Kirsten had died or where her remains were. They asked the court to consider the absence of a known cause of death and the long passage of time since the alleged crime. The judge, addressing the courtroom, remarked on the extraordinary nature of the case. He noted the persistence of law enforcement and the advancements in forensic science that made the conviction possible. He also spoke of the community's long-held hope for justice and how that had now been partly realized. Ultimately, The jury recommended the harshest sentence permitted under Oklahoma law for the charges: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge accepted the recommendation, formally sentencing Anthony Palma to life behind bars. The sentence ensured that Palma would never be released and marked the legal closure of a case that had begun 20 years earlier. The aftermath of this sentencing brought a mix of relief and unresolved grief. For Kirsten's family, the verdict and sentence provided a form of justice, but not the full closure that could come only with the recovery of her remains. The courtroom proceedings had revived painful memories but also affirmed that the system had not forgotten her case. In public statements, law enforcement officials commended the determination of those who had worked on the case over the decades. They acknowledged the importance of maintaining open files on cold cases and credited advancements in DNA technology with solving what once seemed unsolvable. For many in the community, the sentencing served as a sobering reminder of how long justice can take and how fragile safety can be. The knowledge that the perpetrator had lived undetected in the neighborhood for so many years added to the weight of the crime. The case prompted new conversations about child safety, community awareness, and the importance of vigilance even in seemingly quiet environments. Though a sentence had been handed down and the legal chapter had closed, questions remained. Kirsten Hatfield's body had not been found. Investigators continued to urge the public to come forward with any information that might help locate her remains. The hope was that someday, the last piece of the puzzle could be recovered and her family could finally lay her to rest. Anthony Palma began serving his life sentence in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary following his conviction in 2017. The prison, known for housing some of the state's most dangerous offenders, became the final stop for a man who had evaded justice for nearly 2 decades. Despite the conviction, Palma never provided information about what had happened to Kirsten Hatfield after her disappearance. He maintained silence, offering no confession and no location of the body. 2 years into his incarceration, on January 11, 2019, Palma was found unresponsive in his cell. He had been attacked and killed by his cellmate. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections later confirmed that the death was a homicide, the result of blunt force trauma. Palma's death marked a sudden and violent end to a case that had already shaken the state. He died without revealing the final truth about Kirsten's fate. News of his death reached Kirsten's family quickly. While it did not bring closure, it did close the door on any possibility of further information from him. The loss of a potential source of answers only deepened the family's pain. Without a confession or the recovery of Kirsten's remains, they were left with unresolved questions that no court verdict could answer. Despite the finality of Palma's fate, law enforcement agencies did not close the investigation into Kirsten's disappearance. The search for her body continued in a limited capacity. Investigators reviewed Palma's history, locations he may have visited, and any places he might have had access to at the time of the abduction. Using updated mapping and ground scanning technology, authorities examined several sites, but no remains were recovered. Public appeals were renewed periodically. Posters and billboards again urged anyone with information to come forward. The reward fund remained active, and community efforts persisted in memory of Kirsten. Her disappearance continued to serve as a focal point for child safety advocacy in Oklahoma. Law enforcement officials often cited the case in training and public discussions about cold cases and forensic innovation. In the years following Palma's arrest and death, the Kirsten Hatfield case became a cautionary example of how crimes can go unsolved for decades and how perpetrators can live undetected in plain sight. It highlighted the importance of preserving evidence, the value of technological progress, and the role of perseverance in long-term investigations. Kirsten's mother and surviving family members continued to speak about her publicly. Each anniversary brought new interviews and reflections on her life. Though her body had not been found, the family held private memorials, honoring her memory in the absence of a grave. The community of Midwest City remembered the case as one of its darkest chapters, a moment when its sense of security was forever altered. Law enforcement officials emphasized that the case, while legally resolved, remained incomplete. They continued to pursue any leads and maintained a dedicated file on potential burial locations or witness information. The hope was that someday, with new information or chance discovery, Kirsten's remains might be found, and her family could finally find peace. The legacy of the case stretched beyond the investigation. It influenced protocols in missing child cases, underscored the importance of neighborhood vigilance, and inspired improvements in how evidence is collected and preserved. Forensic science programs cited the case as an example of the power of DNA technology to resolve long-dormant mysteries. More than 2 decades after her disappearance, Kirsten Hatfield's story remains a symbol of loss, resilience, and the pursuit of justice. Though her body has not been recovered, the determination to find her continues. In courtrooms, police files, and community memory, her case endures, unfinished, but never forgotten. It was an unseasonably warm Friday afternoon on October 27, 1989, in Bay Village, Ohio, a quiet lakeside suburb west of Cleveland. At 10 years old, Amy Miljevic was a 5th-grade student at Bay Middle School. Her day started like any other, attending class and interacting with classmates, showing no signs of apprehension or distress. As the school day ended, Amy parted ways with her friends and made her way toward the Bay Square Shopping Center. The center, a modest hub for local errands and weekend routines, was bustling with after-school activity. Witnesses later recalled seeing Amy near the plaza's Baskin-Robbins ice cream shop. She appeared to be waiting for someone. Several bystanders noticed her speaking with an adult male, estimated to be in his 30s. He was described as slim, with dark hair, wearing a beige windbreaker and black pants. The man placed his hand gently on Amy's shoulder as they walked together toward the parking lot, away from the crowd. It would be the last time Amy was seen alive. The events that led Amy to the shopping center that day began earlier in the week. She had received a phone call at home from a man claiming he knew her mother, Margaret Miljevic. He told Amy that her mother had recently received a promotion at work, and that he wanted Amy's help in choosing a gift to surprise her. The man instructed her to keep the plan a secret, presenting it as a fun, thoughtful surprise. Amy, trusting and eager to please, agreed. On the day of the abduction, Amy left a note in her school locker telling a friend she was going to meet someone about a job. She never told her mother or brother. She had followed the man's instructions closely, even wearing her denim jacket and carrying a turquoise horse-shaped earring, both of which would later be reported missing. As evening fell and Amy did not return home, her family grew increasingly concerned. Margaret began calling around, first checking with friends and then contacting the police when no one had seen Amy since school. A missing persons report was filed that night, and a search was launched immediately. The quiet comfort of Bay Village was shattered. Police canvassed the shopping center, interviewing employees and customers, collecting witness statements, and compiling a composite sketch based on descriptions of the man seen with Amy. Despite their efforts, the investigation produced no immediate leads. Amy Miljevic had vanished without a trace. As the sun rose on October 28, 1989, the search for Amy Miljevic intensified. Overnight, local police, assisted by volunteers, had expanded the search grid beyond Bay Square Shopping Center. Flyers with Amy's photograph, blonde hair, blue eyes, a friendly smile, were distributed across Cuyahoga County. Television stations and newspapers quickly picked up the story, drawing widespread attention. Bay Village, a place unaccustomed to violent crime, mobilized in full force. Officers from surrounding jurisdictions offered support, while residents formed search parties combing nearby parks, wooded areas, and neighborhoods. Police retraced Amy's last known steps, interviewing students, parents, teachers, and shopkeepers. Canvassing efforts included door-to-door inquiries and checks of vacant buildings. Investigators focused on the mysterious phone call that had lured Amy to the shopping center. Her mother, Margaret, recalled the man's claim that he worked with her and wanted Amy's help picking out a gift. This led authorities to consider how the caller obtained personal information. Attention turned to class field trip rosters and school directories, which were sometimes posted or left unsecured. A composite sketch of the suspect was produced based on witness accounts. Though somewhat vague, the image depicted a man of average build and appearance, features common enough to yield numerous false leads. Meanwhile, the FBI joined the investigation, recognizing patterns similar to past child abduction cases. Agents began compiling a list of known sex offenders and individuals with histories of child-related crimes within a multi-county radius. Amy's disappearance struck a nerve nationally. News outlets carried daily updates. Thousands of tips poured in, many spurred by televised segments and reward offers. Police pursued leads tirelessly, but most turned out to be unsubstantiated sightings or speculative connections. Every car sighting, every unknown caller report, was logged and followed up. At Bay Middle School, grief counselors were brought in. Students were interviewed individually. Staff members reviewed internal procedures for student privacy and security. Amy's classmates, many shocked by the news, recalled that she seemed excited about a secret plan just days before her disappearance. The Miljevic family endured mounting stress under public scrutiny. Despite the media attention, they maintained composure, often making personal appeals for Amy's safe return. Her father, Mark, appeared on television with a plea for any information. As days turned to weeks, hope slowly gave way to dread. By early November, over 50 investigators were actively working the case, reviewing hundreds of names and theories. They scoured waterways and backroads. Helicopters and K-9 units were deployed in deeper terrain. Despite their efforts, the investigation remained stalled. No body, no crime scene, no definitive trace of Amy's abductor. As Thanksgiving approached, yellow ribbons adorned trees in Bay Village. Candlelight vigils and prayer services were held. The community clung to hope, refusing to believe that one of their own could vanish so completely in daylight. Yet, beneath the surface, fear and suspicion settled in. Until Amy was found, closure was impossible. On February 8, 1990, over 3 months after Amy Miljevic disappeared, a jogger running along a rural road in Ruggles Township, Ashland County, spotted what appeared to be remains in a field just off County Road 1181. The location, approximately 50 miles southwest of Bay Village, was remote, surrounded by farmland and lightly traveled roads. Law enforcement arrived at the scene quickly. What they found confirmed the worst fears of a community that had held out hope. The decomposed body was partially covered by leaves and brush. Though difficult to identify immediately due to exposure to the elements, articles of clothing helped confirm the identity: Amy Miljevic. The denim jacket she had worn the day she vanished was found at the scene, along with other clothing items. Her turquoise earrings, shaped like horse heads, were missing. So was her leather binder and backpack. Nearby, investigators discovered strands of gold fibers and other potential trace evidence. The site was carefully documented and sealed off, and the remains were sent to the coroner for examination. An autopsy revealed that Amy had suffered a blow to the head and was stabbed in the neck. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. The time of death was estimated to be close to the time of her abduction, indicating she was likely killed within days of going missing. Forensic experts faced challenges due to the condition of the body, but they were able to collect several hair and fiber samples for analysis. The location of the body raised critical questions. Ruggles Township was not connected to Amy or her family. No obvious ties existed between the rural field and Bay Village. Investigators theorized that the site had been chosen deliberately, isolated, rarely visited, and distant from any known connection to the victim. Search teams combed the area in a wide radius for additional evidence. A curtain with an unusual pattern and a blanket were found within several hundred feet of the body. Their origin was unknown. The curtain was traced to a manufacturer but not to a specific purchaser. These items were collected and preserved in the hopes that future forensic techniques might extract more information. The discovery reignited the investigation. New leads emerged, including renewed analysis of the composite sketch and reinvestigation of individuals previously considered. The FBI intensified its involvement, dispatching more agents to assist the Bay Village Police Department. A reward was increased, and public appeals were broadcast again, urging anyone with information to come forward. Amy's funeral took place days later in a private ceremony. The small white casket was surrounded by photographs, flowers, and the grief of a community that had watched and waited for her return. Schoolmates and neighbors gathered to say goodbye, while law enforcement officials doubled their efforts to bring her killer to justice. For many in Bay Village and beyond, the discovery brought a mix of heartbreak and resolve. The horror of what had happened was now certain. Yet, even with the discovery of her body, there was no clear path to answers, no suspect, no confession, no closure. In the weeks following the discovery of Amy Mihaljevic's body, investigators returned to the evidence with renewed urgency. Items found at the crime scene became focal points of forensic examination. The curtain and blanket recovered near her remains, both stained and weathered, offered the possibility of trace evidence. Fibers, hairs, and potential DNA sources were collected, catalogued, and compared against known individuals. Among the most perplexing clues was the gold-colored fiber found on Amy's body and clothing. Investigators determined that the fiber likely came from an automobile, possibly from carpeting or interior fabric. This suggested that Amy had spent time in a car either during her abduction or before her death. Analysts worked to identify the make and model that matched the fiber, narrowing it down to several possibilities common in the late 1980s. Attention also turned to the items that were missing. Her turquoise horse-shaped earrings, a distinctive gift from her mother, were never found. Neither was her binder, often carried for schoolwork, or her backpack. The absence of these personal effects led investigators to theorize they might have been kept as trophies by the killer or disposed of elsewhere. The FBI continued interviewing individuals who had known Amy or her family, expanding their inquiries to coworkers of her parents, teachers, and even local residents who had prior criminal records. Polygraph tests were administered to several persons of interest. While no one was ruled out definitively, none produced the evidence needed for an arrest. Tips from the public trickled in. Some claimed to have seen a girl matching Amy's description in various towns in the weeks after her disappearance, but none of the sightings were verified. A few leads hinted at similar attempts to lure other girls in the area using phone calls with fabricated stories. These cases were cross-referenced with Amy's but produced no definitive suspect. One promising line of inquiry emerged from a woman who reported that a man had contacted her daughter weeks before Amy's abduction using a similar story. This individual, like Amy's caller, claimed to be connected to the girl's mother and suggested meeting to buy a gift. The girl, however, told her parents, and the meeting never took place. The lead raised the possibility that Amy's abductor may have attempted the same ploy multiple times, possibly targeting a specific profile. Police sketched a behavioral profile based on the known facts. The abductor had to be someone familiar with the area and comfortable enough to approach a child in daylight without attracting suspicion. He had access to personal information about Amy's family, and could convincingly pose as a friend or colleague of her mother. His ability to disappear from a busy shopping center with Amy, leaving no witnesses to a struggle, indicated calculated planning. Despite the efforts, no fingerprints, no usable biological DNA, and no eyewitness accounts directly tied any suspect to the crime. The leads were plentiful, but the evidence was thin. Amy's case remained open, its clues locked in binders and storage rooms, waiting for the one detail that could tie it all together. As the 1990s progressed, the investigation into Amy Mihaljevic's murder remained active, though the pace slowed as initial leads were exhausted. Detectives and FBI agents continued working through a growing list of potential suspects. Each was scrutinized for any connection to Amy, her family, or the Bay Village community. They examined employment histories, criminal records, and even alibis for the day of the abduction. One method investigators used to identify suspects was a careful review of individuals who had access to children's information, volunteers, teachers, and individuals involved in school events. Some suspicion fell on those who had worked or volunteered at the Lake Erie Nature and Science Center, where Amy and her brother had visited. The center had distributed lists of students and families for events, creating a potential source of private information that could have been exploited. The FBI created a detailed timeline of Amy's movements, comparing it against the travel patterns of various persons of interest. Surveillance logs were kept on selected individuals. In several cases, suspects were brought in for questioning and subjected to lie detector tests. Some failed the tests, but no physical evidence ever tied them to the crime. Other suspects had credible alibis or no direct connection to Amy or her family. Despite the years passing, investigators never treated the case as cold. They periodically re-interviewed witnesses, hoping that shifting memories or changes in personal relationships might surface new facts. In some instances, people who had once been reluctant to speak came forward. Others, previously unsure about what they had seen or heard, now believed their memories could matter. Technological advances in forensic science offered new hope. Evidence collected in 1989 and 1990, such as hairs, fibers, and potential biological materials, was preserved meticulously. As DNA testing capabilities improved, analysts returned to these items, seeking even the smallest fragments that might produce a profile. The public, too, remained engaged. Amy's story continued to be featured on television programs and in newspapers. Each anniversary of her disappearance, or the discovery of her body, renewed interest. Her parents cooperated with media efforts, believing attention could generate a critical tip. Over the years, the reward fund grew, enticing informants to step forward. In parallel, a few private investigators began their own efforts, combing through public records, old police files, and community rumors. Some fixated on individuals who had been considered early suspects, revisiting their histories and looking for overlooked connections. None found the breakthrough needed. Among investigators, a growing consensus formed that Amy's abductor likely had attempted similar contact with other girls. Several reports described unknown men contacting young girls by phone with suspicious questions or false stories. In each case, the man used personal details to create trust. These attempts, eerily similar to the circumstances of Amy's case, strengthened the theory that her abduction was premeditated and part of a larger behavioral pattern. Still, the investigation faced the same roadblock: circumstantial suspicion without forensic proof. Even strong leads collapsed under scrutiny or lack of physical evidence. The search for Amy's killer became a quiet but relentless pursuit, one that moved forward inch by inch, year after year. In the months and years after Amy Mihaljevic's abduction and murder, Bay Village transformed. A town once defined by its quiet streets and neighborly charm became a community bound by loss and driven by a need for justice. Residents rallied around the Miljevic family and supported law enforcement efforts with unwavering resolve. Local businesses and schools organized fundraisers to support the ongoing investigation. Billboards bearing Amy's face appeared across Northeast Ohio, ensuring her story remained visible. Annual walks and candlelight vigils became tradition, moments to honor her memory and remind the public that the case remained unsolved. Her name, once just part of a classroom roster, came to symbolize the fragility of innocence. The case altered daily life in Bay Village. Parents grew more cautious. Schools implemented new safety protocols, verifying absences, limiting access to student information, and increasing supervision during after-school hours. Children were taught to be wary of strangers, even those claiming to know their family. For a generation of students, Amy's story was a formative warning. Community volunteers played an essential role in maintaining momentum. Flyers continued to circulate well into the 1990s. Residents formed networks to share observations and theories, and some assisted in distributing updated sketches or canvassing neighborhoods when new information surfaced. At every town event, someone brought up Amy, her smile, her kindness, her unfinished life. Support for the Miljevics was steadfast. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers brought meals, ran errands, and helped shield the family from excessive media attention. Yet the pressure was inescapable. The case had become part of the town's identity, and so too had the sorrow. Margaret Miljevic became a quiet figure of strength, often seen at memorials or community forums. Her dignity in the face of loss inspired many, and her presence reminded others of the stakes involved. Over time, Amy's case attracted national attention, bringing in advocacy groups and crime victim organizations. Bay Village collaborated with larger communities, sharing information and participating in broader campaigns against child abduction. Schools used Amy's story in educational materials, emphasizing personal safety and the importance of communication between children and parents. Despite the years passing, reminders of Amy's life were ever present. Her name appeared on playground plaques, school memorials, and scholarship funds. Former classmates, now adults, carried the memory of her friendship into their own families, sharing her story with their children not out of fear, but remembrance. For Bay Village, Amy was never forgotten. The town, scarred but united, continued to speak her name, hang her photo, and light candles each October. Her story became part of the town's fabric, not only as a tragedy but as a testament to the resilience of a community determined never to let go. Decades after Amy Miljevic's murder, scientific advancements provided a new wave of hope in the long unsolved case. Forensic methods that were either unavailable or in their infancy in 1989 had matured into powerful tools for investigators. As law enforcement agencies around the country began solving cold cases through DNA evidence, attention returned once again to the materials collected in Amy's investigation. Throughout the initial inquiry, evidence had been preserved with foresight. Clothing, fibers, hair strands, and items found near her remains were stored in secure conditions, allowing for later re-examination. As DNA technology became more sensitive, analysts began revisiting these items, hoping to extract viable genetic profiles from the smallest traces. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when forensic scientists detected male DNA on the clothing Amy had worn. Though the sample was partial and degraded, it offered enough information to begin creating a usable profile. This discovery marked a turning point. Until then, the case had relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and witness statements. Now there was the possibility of connecting a suspect biologically to the crime. The DNA profile was entered into national databases, but no match was immediately found. The unknown male's genetic material did not correspond to any individuals previously arrested or convicted of crimes. Still, the profile became a benchmark. Suspects were now tested against it. Each new lead underwent DNA comparison, providing a clear standard for inclusion or elimination. This development also sparked collaboration with private labs specializing in advanced genetic genealogy. By analyzing the DNA and comparing it to public ancestry databases, forensic genealogists attempted to build a family tree of the unknown male. Though the process was time-consuming and required careful validation, it opened new investigative possibilities that had not existed before. Parallel efforts continued to extract DNA from other items. The curtain found near Amy's body, for instance, was re-examined for skin cells or trace evidence. Though many items had been exposed to weather and environmental degradation, techniques such as touch DNA offered new avenues of inquiry. Even the smallest fragment could now yield results that would have been inconceivable in the 1990s. Investigators also began reviewing older suspect interviews in light of the new DNA evidence. Those who had once seemed plausible but lacked physical ties to the crime could now be definitively ruled out or reconsidered. In some cases, family members of deceased suspects were contacted to provide DNA samples for exclusion or potential familial matches. While these scientific advances did not yield an immediate arrest, they reignited hope. The Miljevic family and the community were updated as progress unfolded, reassured that the case was not forgotten. Each new test, each new analysis, moved the investigation closer to resolution. Amy's case had entered a new era, one in which science could speak when memory failed, and where even decades-old secrets had the chance to be uncovered through a strand of DNA. In 2021, the investigation into Amy Miljevic's murder took a dramatic turn. After more than 3 decades, a person of interest emerged, someone who had previously existed only as a peripheral figure. The renewed focus began with a statement from a woman who had once been close to the man in question. In recent interviews, she described behavior that disturbed her, including unsettling remarks made years earlier about Amy's case. The man, a former area resident, had lived near Bay Village at the time of Amy's abduction and had worked in a job that gave him access to children's personal information. Investigators discovered that he had volunteered for public events and had attended functions where student contact details were available. His connection to local schools and youth programs raised immediate red flags. Detectives revisited records and logs from the original investigation. They found that the man had not been formally interviewed in 1989 or 1990, but had been noted peripherally due to his proximity to certain leads. At the time, the volume of information and lack of hard evidence had kept him off the main suspect list. Now, with modern investigative tools and witness re-evaluations, he moved to the center of attention. A search warrant was executed at his residence. Investigators collected electronic devices, writings, and items that could potentially link him to the crime. DNA samples were obtained and compared to the male DNA profile previously extracted from Amy's clothing. The results were inconclusive, not a match, but not fully excluded. The limited nature of the sample left some ambiguity, prompting further analysis. Background checks revealed troubling behavior. The man had no violent criminal record, but there were incidents involving boundary violations and inappropriate comments toward minors. None had led to formal charges, but when considered alongside his access to student information and presence in the community at the time of Amy's disappearance, the pattern concerned investigators. Further interviews with former acquaintances uncovered small but consistent oddities, offhand comments about the case, changes in routine following Amy's murder, and conflicting statements made over the years. Though none amounted to direct evidence, the cumulative weight of these inconsistencies kept him under close scrutiny. Investigators continued monitoring his activity and interactions, employing surveillance where legally permissible. They sought corroboration of his whereabouts on the day Amy was taken and examined whether he had ever owned a vehicle matching those seen near the shopping plaza. The leads, while promising, again stopped short of delivering conclusive proof. The public was not informed of this development at the time. Authorities chose to keep details confidential, avoiding premature speculation or harm to the integrity of the investigation. Internally, however, the case entered a new phase, focused, cautious, and centered on one person for the first time in years. Though no arrest followed, the emergence of a credible suspect after so long offered a renewed sense of direction. Investigators remained mindful that time eroded memory and evidence, but it also shifted relationships, opened consciences, and created chances for truth to surface. The man remained under investigation, his actions and history now under a microscope. More than 3 decades after Amy Mihaljevic's murder, the investigation remains open and active. Despite the passage of time, her case continues to be one of the most closely watched unsolved child homicides in Ohio. Investigators have refused to let it slip into obscurity, and public interest in the case has remained strong, driven by media coverage, documentaries, and online communities dedicated to solving cold cases. The FBI and local authorities continue to seek assistance from the public. Each year, near the anniversary of Amy's disappearance, new appeals are issued. These calls often include updates on the investigation, reminders of the reward for information, and appeals to anyone who might know something but has remained silent. The messages emphasize that loyalties change, memories return, and it is never too late to come forward. Efforts to reach potential witnesses have expanded into modern platforms. Social media campaigns, digital billboards, and podcasts have brought renewed visibility to the case. Law enforcement has also embraced crowdsourcing, encouraging amateur sleuths and online communities to review timelines, suspect behavior, and geographic clues. While these contributions are carefully filtered and verified, they've occasionally generated promising leads. One focus has been locating Amy's missing items: her turquoise earrings, her notebook, her backpack, believed to have been taken by her killer. Authorities have reissued images and detailed descriptions, hoping someone might recognize them or recall seeing them discarded. The recovery of any of these personal effects could provide vital forensic or contextual evidence. Another continued line of inquiry involves the origin of the curtain and blanket found near her remains. Investigators have asked the public to examine family photos from the 1980s that might show similar household items. The appeal is based on the idea that these materials, once common in homes, might be identified by a relative or friend, linking them to a specific location or individual. The DNA profile extracted from Amy's clothing remains central. Advances in forensic genealogy offer new potential paths. Law enforcement has worked with specialized labs to refine the sample and expand the search for familial matches. Even distant relatives could eventually lead to identification through family trees and public records. The suspect identified in 2021 remains under quiet observation. While he has not been charged, investigators continue to gather evidence, reviewing his past movements, relationships, and statements. Any new discovery could shift the balance toward an arrest, but for now, the case remains a puzzle, frustratingly close to answers, yet just out of reach. The public, for its part, has never abandoned the case. Each news story, each update, is met with a wave of renewed interest. Strangers share theories, locals revisit old memories, and former classmates express hope for closure. Amy's story has persisted across generations, passed from parents to children as both a caution and a call to remain vigilant. For law enforcement, the message remains consistent: the case is not cold. Amy Mihaljevic's killer is still being pursued. With time, science, and public cooperation, the hope endures that justice will one day be served. The abduction and murder of Amy Mihaljevic left a lasting imprint not only on Bay Village but across the country. Her case became a pivotal moment in how child disappearances were understood, investigated, and remembered. What began as a missing persons report in a quiet suburb evolved into a decades-long pursuit of justice that reshaped community awareness, investigative protocols, and public engagement. In the years following Amy's death, law enforcement agencies adjusted their approach to child abductions. The urgency of the Miljevic case contributed to the development of improved response strategies, including faster coordination between local police and federal agencies, quicker media alerts, and more systematic gathering of early evidence. The case was studied in law enforcement training, emphasizing the importance of preserving crime scenes, securing witness statements quickly, and maintaining evidence integrity over time. Within Bay Village, Amy's memory became deeply woven into the community's identity. Memorial plaques, scholarships, and safety campaigns carried her name. Schools enhanced protections, and children were taught not just to be wary of strangers but to speak up when something felt wrong. Her story became part of the cultural memory, an event parents recalled vividly, and teachers referenced in safety lessons. Amy's family, though marked by unimaginable grief, helped drive changes in public awareness. They participated in awareness campaigns, worked with victim advocacy organizations, and supported legislative efforts that emphasized child protection and improved support for families enduring similar tragedies. Beyond policy and practice, Amy's legacy was deeply human. Her story resonated with people who never knew her smile captured in photographs, her trust betrayed in a moment that still haunts many. It spurred thousands to action: volunteers, investigators, journalists, and ordinary citizens who refuse to forget. Her case has been the subject of books, documentaries, and news features, each attempt to keep her memory alive and her case active. The digital age introduced new possibilities for resolution. Online communities formed around solving cold cases, and Amy's was often among the most discussed. These groups sifted through old clues, compiled timelines, and debated theories, helping to maintain public pressure and visibility. For some, the quest for justice became personal, a commitment to ensure Amy's killer could not remain hidden forever. Through it all, Amy's name has endured not as a headline but as a symbol of a community's resilience, a family's strength, and a child whose voice continues to echo. Her absence shaped a generation, and her story serves as both a warning and a call to vigilance. While the investigation continues and hope remains for resolution, her legacy is already profound, etched into the hearts of those who remember and those who still seek the truth. On the morning of September 20th, 1988, 19-year-old Tara Lee Calico departed her home on Brugg Street in Belen, New Mexico, for her routine 36-mile bicycle ride along New Mexico State Road 47. She rode her mother's neon-pink Huffy mountain bike, as her own was damaged. Tara was dressed in a white t-shirt with First National Bank of Belen printed on it, white shorts with green stripes, white ankle socks, and white and turquoise Avia tennis shoes. She also wore a gold butterfly ring with a diamond insert, a gold amethyst ring, and half-inch gold hoop earrings. Carrying her Sony Walkman, she listened to music during her ride. Tara had informed her mother, Patty Dole, that she planned to return by noon to play tennis with her boyfriend at 12:30 p.m. When Tara did not return as expected, Patty began searching along Tara's usual route. Around 3 p.m., after unsuccessful attempts to locate her daughter, Patty reported Tara missing to the Valencia County Sheriff's Department. During the search, authorities discovered fragments of Tara's Sony Walkman and a cassette tape along the roadside. Her bicycle was never found. Several witnesses reported seeing Tara riding her bike along Highway 47 around 11:45 a.m., approximately 2 miles from her home. Notably, some witnesses observed a dirty white or light gray 1953 Ford pickup truck with a white homemade shell following closely behind her. No one witnessed an abduction. Despite extensive search efforts involving local and state police, as well as hundreds of volunteers combing the area on foot, horseback, four-wheelers, and planes, no further evidence was found. Tara's disappearance remains one of New Mexico's most perplexing unsolved cases. On the morning of September 20th, 1988, Tara Lee Calico followed a routine she had kept for years. At 19, the bright and active University of New Mexico sophomore left her home in Belen, New Mexico, for her daily bike ride. The sun was out, and the skies were clear, ideal conditions for the route she often took south along New Mexico State Road 47. She borrowed her mother's neon pink Huffy mountain bike because her own had a flat tire. Tara told her mother, Patty Dole, that she planned to be back before noon to get ready for a tennis date with her boyfriend. Tara was seen several times during her ride that morning. Witnesses later described her attire: a white t-shirt with a local bank logo, green and white striped shorts, white socks, and turquoise and white tennis shoes. She wore her usual jewelry, hoop earrings and 2 rings, and carried a Sony Walkman, listening to music as she pedaled down the familiar highway shoulder. She was last seen around 11:45 a.m., a few miles from home. When Tara did not return by the expected time, her mother felt something was wrong. By mid-afternoon, she began driving the route herself, hoping to find her daughter. There was no sign of Tara or the pink Huffy. As the hours passed, Patty contacted the Valencia County Sheriff's Office to report her daughter missing. Authorities began a search of the area. Pieces of Tara's cassette player and a cassette tape were found on the roadside, suggesting a struggle or an accident. However, the bike itself was never recovered. Multiple witnesses reported seeing an older model light-colored pickup truck with a camper shell following closely behind Tara, but the vehicle was never identified. Volunteers joined law enforcement in searching the area on foot, horseback, and from the air. The efforts yielded no trace beyond the broken Walkman. No one reported hearing a scream or seeing an abduction, but the fear grew that Tara had not left voluntarily. As darkness fell on Belen, the quiet New Mexico town was left shaken. Tara Calico, by all accounts reliable, responsible, and punctual, had vanished in broad daylight along a route she had biked countless times. Her disappearance marked the beginning of a case that would span decades, haunt her family, and remain one of the most enduring mysteries in the Southwest. In the immediate aftermath of Tara Calico's disappearance, the Valencia County Sheriff's Office launched an investigation that initially treated the case as a missing person rather than a suspected abduction. Deputies retraced the bike route, collecting the fragments of Tara's Walkman and cassette tape that were discovered along the shoulder of State Road 47. The items were found scattered over a short distance, suggesting they may have been dropped or discarded in haste. Despite the absence of Tara's bicycle, there was no clear evidence of a struggle. This lack of definitive physical evidence complicated the early stages of the investigation. Witnesses came forward with observations from the morning Tara disappeared. Some described seeing her riding along the road, alone and listening to music. Others mentioned a suspicious vehicle, a white or light gray pickup truck with a camper shell, that had been seen trailing behind her. Law enforcement canvassed the area, interviewing residents, store owners, and drivers who frequently traveled the road. They issued bulletins to neighboring counties and states, distributed flyers, and released Tara's photograph to the media. Her story was soon picked up by local news outlets, and her parents held interviews, urging anyone with information to come forward. Patty Dole was deeply involved from the beginning, pushing authorities to consider the possibility of foul play. She and Tara's stepfather, John Dole, conducted their own searches, coordinated volunteers, and pressed for more aggressive action. They created posters, contacted national missing person organizations, and maintained steady pressure on the sheriff's office. As days turned into weeks, leads began to dwindle. None of the vehicle sightings yielded a match. No witnesses had seen an actual abduction. The pink Huffy bike remained missing, and without further physical evidence, the investigation stalled. In the absence of definitive clues, the case remained open but with few active leads. By the end of 1988, Tara's disappearance was still unsolved, and frustration mounted. The sheriff's department continued to field tips, but none brought them closer to an explanation. Friends and family held vigils, hoping for a breakthrough. Although Tara was officially classified as a missing person, those closest to her feared she had been taken against her will. The investigation remained at a standstill, with no arrests, no suspects, and no tangible progress. What began as a missing person report was now regarded as a potential abduction, though without direct evidence, the designation remained uncertain. The quiet highway in Belen had become the last known trace of Tara Calico. In June 1989, 9 months after Tara Calico vanished, a surprising development drew national attention. In Port St. Joe, Florida, over 1,000 miles from Belen, a woman exited a convenience store and noticed a Polaroid photograph lying in the parking lot. The image showed a young woman and a boy, both bound and gagged with black tape, lying on a bed inside what appeared to be a van. The woman who found the photo immediately notified police. The photograph was turned over to local authorities, who then contacted the FBI. Analysis of the image began in earnest. The girl in the picture bore a resemblance to Tara Calico. The boy was never identified, but he was later speculated to be Michael Henley, a New Mexico child who had also disappeared in 1988. For Tara's family, the image offered a chilling but possible connection. Patty and John Dole studied the photograph closely. Patty believed the girl in the photo was Tara, citing the hair color, facial features, and a scar on the leg that matched her daughter's. A paperback book was visible near the girl in the image, reportedly one of Tara's favorites. The family urged authorities to compare the photo with Tara's known physical characteristics. Multiple agencies analyzed the photograph, including the FBI and Scotland Yard. Their conclusions were not unified. Some believed the girl could be Tara, while others determined it was unlikely. Despite this, the photo was widely publicized. Television shows and newspapers picked up the story, bringing renewed attention to Tara's case. Further investigation into the photo included attempts to identify the van's interior. The paneling, window shades, and upholstery were reviewed for clues. However, no solid leads emerged from the background or context. The photo itself lacked metadata or any accompanying information, and the person who dropped it was never found. Meanwhile, in 1990, Michael Henley's remains were discovered in the Zuni Mountains, about 10 miles from his family's campsite. His death was ruled unrelated to Tara's disappearance. This finding cast doubt on the theory that the boy in the Polaroid was Henley, and by extension, questioned whether the girl was Tara. The Polaroid remained a powerful image, an unsettling artifact that kept the case in the public eye but offered no conclusive answers. For Tara's family, it was both a source of hope and anguish. They clung to the possibility that she was still alive, but the lack of definitive identification left them in a prolonged state of uncertainty. Though the photograph prompted an influx of tips and media coverage, the investigation into Tara's whereabouts remained stalled. No one stepped forward to claim responsibility for the image. The trail, once again, grew cold, anchored only by a disturbing snapshot that raised more questions than it answered. Over the years, Tara Calico's disappearance generated numerous theories, tip-offs, and alleged sightings, yet none led to a definitive answer. As time passed and no arrest was made, speculation intensified. Investigators, reporters, and amateur sleuths examined the case from multiple angles, drawing out sparse evidence and evolving accounts. One early theory centered on an accident. Some speculated Tara had been struck by a vehicle, and the driver, fearful of consequences, had panicked and disposed of her body. This scenario seemed plausible to some investigators, especially given the fragments of her Walkman and the lack of other physical evidence. However, the condition and location of the broken cassette player raised doubts about whether the items had simply fallen or had been intentionally placed. Another theory gained traction when witnesses described the suspicious pickup truck seen tailing Tara during her ride. Despite repeated public calls for information, the truck and its driver were never identified. The vehicle, described as an older model with a camper shell, became a focal point, representing the unknown presence that may have been involved in Tara's disappearance. Over time, various individuals claimed to have information. Some offered second-hand stories, while others claimed direct knowledge. Many of these claims lacked credibility or consistency. A few tips were followed up seriously, but none resulted in arrests. Some witnesses later recanted or were found to have fabricated details. In 2008, Valencia County Sheriff René Rivera made a controversial public statement. He claimed he believed Tara had been accidentally killed by two teenagers who had been following her on the road. According to Rivera, after hitting her with their vehicle, they panicked and covered up the incident with help from their families. He asserted that the suspects were known to local authorities but that insufficient evidence prevented prosecution. This announcement deeply upset Tara's family, who criticized the sheriff for making such claims without arrests or supporting evidence. No names were officially released in connection with this theory, and no indictments followed. The statement revived public interest but left the case legally unresolved. The community was left with more questions than answers. Private investigators hired by the Dole family also explored leads, including possible connections to sex trafficking or an abduction by someone known to Tara. However, none of these avenues provided conclusive proof or helped locate her. Anonymous letters, dreams reported as visions, and other fringe contributions frequently arrived over the years. Some alleged sightings of Tara were reported in different states, especially in the early 1990s, but none were confirmed. Theories proliferated, but the case remained defined by a lack of solid, actionable evidence. As time marched forward, investigators maintained the official position that the case was open. But without physical remains, verified sightings, or confessions, the disappearance of Tara Calico remained an enduring mystery built on conflicting leads and unverified claims. By the early 2000s, the Tara Calico case had remained unsolved for over a decade. In Valencia County, new personnel in the sheriff's office brought fresh attention to the long-dormant investigation. In 2008, Sheriff René Rivera announced that investigators had developed a theory involving multiple individuals allegedly responsible for Tara's death and the concealment of her body. Rivera claimed that two teenage boys, known locally at the time of Tara's disappearance, had followed her along State Road 47 in a truck. According to his statement, they may have accidentally hit her and, in a panic, abducted and ultimately killed her. Rivera suggested that the perpetrators' families helped cover up the crime. He indicated that deputies knew the identities of those involved but lacked the physical evidence necessary to make arrests or file charges. The sheriff's public disclosure of this theory drew swift criticism. Tara's family was angered by the release of unverified information without formal charges. They had never been officially briefed on these developments, and felt the announcement jeopardized the case. Despite the attention the statement received, the sheriff's office did not follow up with new actions or further details. The case remained legally unchanged, open, but without arrests. The community response was mixed. Some believed Rivera's theory aligned with long-held suspicions. Others were skeptical, noting the lack of forensic evidence or publicized investigative steps. No names were officially released, and the alleged suspects were never publicly confronted. In the years that followed, Tara's case continued to shift in and out of focus. Tips were still occasionally submitted, but few seemed credible. Local law enforcement faced mounting pressure from Tara's family and the broader public to take more decisive steps. A growing call for outside help prompted new involvement. In 2013, renewed momentum came in the form of a joint effort between local and federal authorities. The FBI and state officials participated in the reinvestigation. A fresh round of interviews began, targeting individuals who had been mentioned in past statements or had lived near Tara's bike route. Investigators also reviewed the case files for inconsistencies or overlooked details. However, despite the revived attention and reassessment of prior evidence, no major breakthroughs emerged. The forensic evidence remained minimal. The pink Huffy bike, a key piece of potential evidence, had never been found. No confession or eyewitness account could be independently corroborated. The reinvestigation underscored the challenges of resolving a decades-old case with few hard leads. Still, it demonstrated that law enforcement had not abandoned the pursuit of answers. Tara Calico's name remained active on law enforcement databases. Her profile still circulated among missing persons alerts. For Tara's family, the renewed investigation brought limited comfort. They continued to advocate for the truth, meeting with officials, updating records, and maintaining the visibility of her case. As new officials cycled into office, each brought with them a decision, whether to revisit the Calico file once more or let it rest until something new emerged. From the early days of Tara Calico's disappearance, the case attracted wide public attention. As media coverage intensified, federal authorities took notice. Within weeks of her vanishing, the FBI opened a file, offering assistance to local law enforcement. Although the case remained under the jurisdiction of the Valencia County Sheriff's Office, federal involvement signaled the seriousness of the investigation. Tara's case soon reached a national audience. Her story aired on television programs dedicated to unsolved crimes, including segments on America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries. These shows reenacted her last known movements and displayed the Polaroid found in Florida, which became a haunting symbol of the case. Viewers across the country submitted tips, some claiming to recognize Tara or the van in the photo. Though none led to a conclusive breakthrough, the exposure kept the case in the public eye. The FBI helped process evidence and review leads, but the absence of critical physical proof remained a challenge. In the early 1990s, federal agents reviewed the available files, photographs, and interviews. They issued bulletins and alerts to law enforcement agencies nationwide, but no matching reports or suspects surfaced. National media attention brought both support and strain to the Calico family. On one hand, the widespread visibility ensured Tara's name was not forgotten. On the other, public scrutiny invited speculation and misinformation. Rumors circulated, often fueled by anonymous tips or misidentified sightings. Some callers insisted Tara had been seen in other states. Others claimed knowledge of her whereabouts. Investigators were forced to vet each one, diverting resources from more credible avenues. In the mid-1990s, the FBI's involvement expanded as new staff re-examined cold case files. Advanced forensic techniques, including enhanced photo analysis and document examination, were applied to the Polaroid and other materials. Yet the lack of original crime scene evidence, such as the missing bike or clothing, limited the effectiveness of these efforts. Despite these limitations, the FBI's continued interest brought legitimacy to the case and encouraged broader cooperation among agencies. Tara was included in federal missing persons databases, and her profile was updated periodically with age-progressed images. These renderings projected how she might look years after her disappearance, in the hope that someone might recognize her. Public campaigns also gained traction. Tara's family distributed thousands of flyers, partnered with missing person advocacy groups and organized community events. Billboards bearing her image were erected along major highways. Her mother, Patty Dole, became a vocal advocate for missing persons and victim rights, using her daughter's case to push for systemic reforms. By the early 2000s, Tara Calico had become one of the most well-known missing persons cases in the country. Her name was often cited in discussions about unsolved abductions, and her case was used as a training example for law enforcement courses. The FBI remained a supporting agency, ready to respond to new leads, but still without the definitive evidence needed to bring charges or close the case. The enduring federal involvement ensured Tara's story would not slip into obscurity. It also reinforced the idea that justice, even decades delayed, remained possible, so long as the case stayed alive in public memory. In 2021, the New Mexico State Police established a dedicated cold case unit to re-examine long-unsolved investigations, and Tara Calico's disappearance was among the first selected. The move signaled a renewed commitment to resolving the case that had haunted the state for over 3 decades. The unit, composed of seasoned detectives and analysts, began a systematic review of all available material. The original files, statements, photos, leads, and forensic reports were reorganized and digitized. Investigators re-interviewed witnesses and examined previous suspects, including those named in local theories over the years. In some cases, individuals who had never spoken to authorities before came forward, encouraged by the new attention and the passage of time. Others, previously silent, were re-questioned to clarify inconsistencies or expand on past accounts. One significant development involved the reassessment of physical evidence. Though the case lacked key items like Tara's bicycle, the cold case unit applied updated forensic techniques to previously collected materials. Advances in DNA analysis, imaging technology, and database matching allowed investigators to test old evidence in ways not possible at the time of the original investigation. However, limitations remained. Many items had degraded over time, and no DNA from a suspect had ever been identified. The team also revisited the Polaroid photograph found in Florida, applying enhanced digital analysis to re-examine facial features and background elements. The image was cross-referenced with national missing persons databases and with files from other unsolved cases. Despite renewed effort, the analysis did not yield new leads. The cold case unit expanded their outreach beyond New Mexico. Coordination with the FBI and national missing persons organizations helped verify prior sightings and remove false leads from consideration. Investigators examined whether Tara could have been trafficked or held in another state, though no verified evidence supported those theories. Public engagement was also a key part of the strategy. The unit launched a media campaign, asking the public to submit tips, photos, or memories related to September 1988 in Belen. Some community members provided previously undisclosed information, including recollections of suspicious activity or vehicles. While none of these new tips led to a breakthrough, they were carefully documented and added to the case file. Despite the lack of a definitive conclusion, the cold case unit's involvement brought a degree of structure and focus that had been missing in earlier efforts. They published updates outlining their work and reaffirmed that the case remained active. The approach was methodical, aiming to build a foundation in the event new evidence emerged. For Tara's family, the renewed investigation offered a tempered hope. Her mother, Patty Dole, had passed away in 2006, never learning the truth. Other family members continued to support the efforts and pushed for answers. The work of the cold case unit became not just a law enforcement initiative, but a symbol that the search for justice was not over. Though no arrests were made, the 2021 initiative served as a reminder that cold cases could still warm. It brought the Calico case back into focus, encouraging those who might have stayed silent for years to come forward and showing that even decades later, the pursuit of truth was still alive. Tara Calico's disappearance reshaped not only the lives of her loved ones but also the broader conversation around missing persons in America. Over the decades, her case remained a touchstone for unresolved disappearances and a rallying point for families seeking justice. The enduring impact began with her family, whose relentless advocacy kept her story in the public eye. Patty Dole, Tara's mother, became the face of the family's search for answers. Tireless in her efforts, she organized campaigns, maintained contact with investigators, and ensured Tara's case remained active. She appeared in interviews, visited schools, and pushed for improvements in how missing persons cases were handled. Patty kept a room in her home preserved for Tara, filled with mementos, gifts, and reminders of the life interrupted. Her advocacy extended well beyond her daughter's case. She supported other families experiencing similar grief, offering guidance and solidarity. Patty's work helped bring about policy changes, including calls for centralized databases for missing persons and standardized procedures for investigations. Tara's case was among those that illustrated the need for better interagency communication, especially across state lines. The limitations of initial local-only investigations became a key lesson for law enforcement training programs. Even after Patty's passing in 2006, the efforts continued. John Dole and other relatives remained committed to keeping Tara's name in the public consciousness. They engaged with the media, participated in events marking anniversaries of her disappearance, and remained in contact with cold case investigators. In the community of Belen, Tara's story is still remembered. Memorials and runs have been held in her honor. Local schools and civic groups have hosted awareness events, often featuring discussions on safety and vigilance. Her case is taught as a reminder of the importance of early, coordinated response to missing persons reports. Nationally, Tara Calico became an emblematic figure. Her photograph, frequently paired with the 1989 Polaroid, has circulated for decades in missing person bulletins. Age progression renderings have kept the public aware of what she might look like today. These efforts ensured that her image was never out of sight for long. Her story has been featured in books, documentaries, and investigative podcasts, reinforcing the broader cultural imprint. While the tone of these productions varies, the common thread is the sense of injustice and the haunting uncertainty that has surrounded the case for more than 3 decades. Perhaps the most enduring part of Tara's legacy is the hope she inspired, not only the hope of her return, but the broader hope that persistence can lead to answers. Though her fate remains unknown, the efforts undertaken in her name have shaped how disappearances are handled, investigated, and remembered. Tara Calico's case is not just about a young woman who vanished. It's about a family that never stopped searching, a community forever altered, and a justice system still trying to find the truth. It is a reminder that every unsolved case is not only a mystery, but a life interrupted, a story waiting for its conclusion. Chandra and Levy was born on April 14, 1977, in Cleveland, Ohio, and raised in Modesto, California. A bright and determined young woman, she pursued her education with ambition, graduating from San Francisco State University with a degree in journalism. Her interests in criminal justice and public affairs led her to graduate studies at the University of Southern California, where she was earning a master's degree in public administration. In early 2001, Levy secured a prestigious internship with the Federal Bureau of Prisons in Washington, D.C. It was an opportunity that aligned with her long-term aspirations of working in law enforcement or government. She moved to the nation's capital with optimism and a strong sense of purpose, renting an apartment in the DuPont Circle neighborhood. Levy quickly adapted to the rhythm of Washington. She was diligent in her duties at the Bureau, and was known among peers for her professionalism and focus. Her internship brought her into contact with key figures in government, and she regularly corresponded with family and friends about her experiences and the future she was building. Despite the rigor of her schedule, she made time to explore the city. She frequented parks, museums, and often jogged or walked in Rock Creek Park, a vast urban wilderness that offered a reprieve from the busyness of Capitol Hill. In her final days of work, she wrapped up her duties at the Bureau and was preparing to return to California for her graduation ceremony. On April 30th, 2001, Levy spoke with her parents, informing them that she had completed her internship and was planning to return home soon. It would be the last confirmed contact she had with them. Her father, Dr. Robert Levy, grew concerned when he couldn't reach her the next day. Calls went unanswered, and messages unreturned. By May 6th, after more than a week of silence, her parents reported her missing to the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. Chandra's disappearance triggered immediate concern among family and friends, but the case would soon draw national attention for reasons few could have predicted. The first days after Chandra Levy vanished were marked by uncertainty and confusion. She had told her parents she would soon be returning home to California, but never arrived. Her phone went silent, and emails ceased. After reporting her missing on May 6, 2001, the Levys flew to Washington, D.C., and began pressing local authorities for action. The Metropolitan Police Department initiated a missing person investigation. Officers visited her DuPont Circle apartment on May 7th. Inside, they found no signs of forced entry or struggle. Her belongings were largely intact. Her wallet and driver's license were located, but her cell phone was missing. Her computer, however, became a critical piece of evidence. A forensic examination of Levy's computer revealed she had conducted a series of searches on May 1st, the day she was last seen. These included directions to Rock Creek Park and the Pierce Klingel mansion within the park. Investigators also found no further activity on her computer after that date. Despite the lead pointing to Rock Creek Park, initial search efforts in the area were not exhaustive. Officers conducted limited searches in the areas identified by Levy's computer activity, but dense vegetation and steep terrain made a thorough search difficult. Compounding the challenge was the absence of a precise location, as GPS tracking was not yet routinely used in such cases. The investigation soon ran into complications. With no clear evidence of foul play and no witnesses, leads were scarce. Friends and colleagues were interviewed, and security footage from nearby businesses was reviewed, but little emerged to clarify her fate. Attention began to turn toward her social connections, particularly her ties to political figures. As days turned into weeks, the Levy family grew frustrated with the pace of the investigation. They conducted their own outreach, putting up missing posters and making media appearances to keep Chandra's name in the public eye. The media, sensing a deeper story, began digging into Chandra's personal life. By late May, it became widely known that Levy had a personal relationship with California Congressman Gary Condit. This revelation would shift the investigation's trajectory and propel the case into the national spotlight. By June 2001, the Chandra Levy case had transformed from a missing person investigation into a national spectacle. The reason was the disclosure of her relationship with Congressman Gary Condit, a Democrat from California's 18th Congressional District. The Levy family had privately shared this information with law enforcement early in the investigation. Publicly, however, the congressman had downplayed the nature of their connection. When the media learned of Condit's involvement, speculation exploded. Reporters swarmed Capitol Hill and Levy's apartment building. News outlets ran continuous coverage, not only on the investigation but on Condit's personal life and potential role in the disappearance. The congressman's evasiveness, including a delayed admission that the relationship was intimate, fueled public distrust. Condit maintained that he had no knowledge of Chandra's whereabouts and denied any involvement in her disappearance. He was interviewed multiple times by police, and though he was not named a suspect, scrutiny intensified. The media focused heavily on his behavior, including reports of other alleged extramarital affairs. Cable news channels aired nightly segments dissecting his actions and statements. The scandal had immediate political ramifications. Condit's public approval plummeted. Calls for accountability grew louder, even as no direct evidence tied him to any wrongdoing. The Levy family, particularly Chandra's mother, Susan Levy, publicly criticized Condit, accusing him of failing to assist in the search for their daughter. Under pressure, Condit eventually gave a televised interview in August 2001 in an attempt to restore his reputation. The move did little to sway public opinion. While he reiterated his innocence and expressed sympathy for the Levy family, his lack of transparency continued to raise doubts. Meanwhile, the investigation remained at a standstill. Authorities struggled to move forward without physical evidence or new leads. Rock Creek Park, a key location indicated by Levy's computer, had still not been fully searched. Months passed with no significant developments. The intersection of a missing intern, a powerful congressman, and an aggressive media campaign kept the case in the headlines. But behind the noise, the central question remained unanswered. What had happened to Chandra Levy? On May 22, 2002, more than a year after Chandra Levy vanished, a man walking his dog in Rock Creek Park discovered human remains near a remote trail off Broad Branch Road. The area, thick with underbrush and far from main paths, had not been part of the initial police search. Investigators from the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department arrived quickly and began securing the scene. Over the following hours, they recovered skeletal remains, scraps of clothing, a jogging bra, and a pair of leggings. A Walkman was also found nearby, partially buried beneath leaves. Based on the location and the items present, authorities suspected they had found Chandra Levy. Dental records confirmed the identity within days. The remains belonged to Chandra and Levy. The discovery transformed the case from a missing person investigation to a homicide inquiry. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner examined the remains but was unable to determine a specific cause of death due to the extent of decomposition. However, the manner of death was classified as a homicide, based on the circumstances and condition of the scene. The discovery raised questions about the earlier search efforts. Although investigators had known about Levy's interest in Rock Creek Park, the area where her remains were ultimately found had not been thoroughly canvassed in 2001. The oversight drew criticism and frustration from the Levy family, who believed more rigorous efforts could have brought closure much sooner. In the aftermath, renewed attention focused on suspects. The political storm surrounding Congressman Gary Condit had already begun to subside. By this point, police had interviewed him extensively and confirmed his alibi. With no physical evidence linking him to the park, and no forensic tie to the remains, the investigation began to pivot in a new direction. Forensic analysis of the items at the scene produced little usable evidence. The passage of time and exposure to the elements had degraded most materials. Yet the location itself offered one critical lead. It was known to law enforcement as a site of previous assaults. Detectives began re-examining past incidents in Rock Creek Park. In doing so, they uncovered an unsettling pattern, a series of attacks on female joggers in the same general area, around the time Levy disappeared. The focus of the case shifted once again, this time toward a man who had already been convicted in connection with those crimes. Following the discovery of Chandra Levy's remains in Rock Creek Park, detectives began re-evaluating earlier incidents in the area. Their attention turned to a series of assaults that had occurred around the time Levy disappeared. Specifically, investigators focused on 2 attacks on female joggers in May and July 2001. Both incidents took place near where Levy's body was found. The perpetrator of those attacks was Ingmar Guandique, a Salvadoran immigrant who had entered the United States illegally. At the time of Levy's disappearance, Guandique was 19 years old and living in Washington, D.C. In 2002, he had been convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison for the 2 assaults in Rock Creek Park. In both cases, he had attacked women jogging alone, striking them from behind and attempting to drag them off the trail. Detectives revisited Guandique's background and prison records. They discovered that while serving time at the federal penitentiary in Victorville, California, Guandique had allegedly confessed to a cellmate that he had attacked Chandra Levy. According to the cellmate, Guandique said he saw Levy in the park and decided to rob her. During the confrontation, he claimed she resisted and he panicked, leading to her death. This information marked a turning point. In 2009, nearly 8 years after Levy's disappearance, Guandique was charged with her murder. Prosecutors emphasized similarities between the known assaults and the circumstances surrounding Levy's death. They argued that Guandique's method, ambushing women alone on trails, matched the presumed scenario in Levy's case. Despite the lack of physical evidence directly linking Guandique to Levy's remains, the prosecution moved forward. They relied heavily on testimony from the jailhouse informant, who claimed Guandique had confessed. Investigators also presented circumstantial evidence, including Guandique's known pattern of behavior, his presence in the area, and his lack of alibi for May 1, 2001. By the time charges were filed, Guandique had already been in prison for several years. His defense team argued that the case was based on unreliable testimony, and that he had been unfairly targeted. Nevertheless, the indictment advanced to trial, setting the stage for a high-profile legal battle that would again draw national attention. The trial of Ingmar Guandique for the murder of Chandra Levy began in October 2010 at the D.C. Superior Court. It had been over 9 years since Levy disappeared, and the case had already endured intense public scrutiny. Despite the passage of time and the absence of physical evidence directly linking Guandique to the crime scene, the prosecution laid out its case with confidence. Prosecutors argued that Guandique had a pattern of attacking women alone in Rock Creek Park and that Levy, out for a walk or jog on the day she vanished, fit the profile of his earlier victims. They introduced testimony from the 2 women whom Guandique had previously assaulted in the same park. Their accounts, while unrelated to Levy's disappearance, were used to establish Guandique's modus operandi. The cornerstone of the prosecution's case was testimony from Armando Morales, a former cellmate of Guandique at the federal penitentiary in California. Morales claimed that Guandique had confessed to killing Levy, describing how he grabbed her from behind, intending to rob her, and fled the scene after she collapsed. Morales stated that Guandique never said he intended to kill Levy but was worried about being caught. The defense challenged Morales' credibility, arguing he was a known gang member and jailhouse informant with motivation to lie. They pointed out inconsistencies in his statements and suggested he fabricated the confession to gain favor with authorities. Defense attorneys also highlighted the lack of forensic evidence, no eyewitnesses, and no physical link between Guandique and the crime scene. Throughout the proceedings, members of the Levy family sat in the courtroom, listening quietly as testimony revisited the darkest period of their lives. Congressman Gary Condit, once at the center of the case, was called to testify, primarily to clarify the nature of his relationship with Levy. His appearance was brief and emotionally subdued. By then, he had long denied any involvement in Levy's disappearance, and no evidence implicated him. On November 22, 2010, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury found Ingmar Guandique guilty of 2 counts of first-degree felony murder. In February 2011, he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. For the Levy family, the verdict brought a measure of closure. They expressed gratitude for the outcome but also acknowledged the long, painful journey to get there. Despite the conviction, questions lingered. Much of the case had rested on the word of a single prison informant, and doubts about the reliability of that testimony would eventually surface again. Following Ingmar Guandik's conviction in 2010 and his sentencing in early 2011, the legal battle continued. Almost immediately, Guandik's defense team filed appeals, arguing that the trial had been fundamentally flawed. Central to their claim was the credibility of the prosecution's key witness, Armando Morales, the former cellmate who alleged that Guandik had confessed to killing Chandra Levy. Defense attorneys contended that Morales had a history of dishonesty and had received undisclosed benefits in exchange for his testimony. They maintained that without Morales' statement, the evidence against Guandik was circumstantial and insufficient to support a conviction. Questions were also raised about whether the government had adequately disclosed Morales' background and incentives during the trial. By 2013, these issues gained traction. New information emerged suggesting that Morales may have lied under oath during Guandik's trial. An internal review by the U.S. Attorney's Office identified problems with the reliability of the testimony, and prosecutors disclosed these findings to the court. This prompted a reassessment of the conviction and raised serious concerns about the integrity of the trial process. In 2015, after extensive review, the D.C. Superior Court granted a new trial for Guandik. The decision was based largely on doubts surrounding Morales' credibility and the possibility that the defense had been deprived of key information during the original proceedings. The ruling vacated the conviction, and Guandik was transferred from federal prison to D.C. jail to await a new trial. The development reignited public interest in the case. For the Levy family, it was a devastating reversal. They had believed that justice had been served in 2010. Now, with the case back in flux, the painful uncertainty returned. Prosecutors began preparing for a retrial, reviewing evidence and witness testimony anew. However, the case had grown colder with time. Witnesses had become harder to reach, memories had faded, and the weaknesses in the original case had only become more pronounced. Without Morales, the foundation of the prosecution's argument was severely weakened. As the retrial loomed, the prosecution faced the difficult question of whether they could prove Guandik's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt without the contested jailhouse confession. Ultimately, the decision would lead to a major turning point in the long-running case. In 2016, after years of legal wrangling and preparation for a retrial, federal prosecutors made a pivotal announcement. The charges against Ingmar Guandik in the murder of Chandra Levy would be dropped. The decision came after a thorough reassessment of the evidence, particularly the crumbling credibility of the central witness, Armando Morales. With no physical evidence and the inability to use Morales' testimony, the prosecution concluded it could no longer meet the burden of proof required for a conviction. The motion to dismiss the case was filed in July 2016 and was accepted by the court. Guandik, who had spent nearly 5 years in prison for Levy's murder in addition to his earlier sentence for unrelated assaults, was formally released from federal custody. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, IC, quickly took him into detention upon release. In May 2017, he was deported to El Salvador. For the Levy family, the dismissal of the case reopened emotional wounds. They had endured 15 years of legal and media battles, only to face the realization that the man once convicted of their daughter's murder was now free. Publicly, they expressed frustration with the criminal justice system but remained committed to pursuing accountability in Chandra's case. The dismissal also marked a dramatic reversal for law enforcement. The original investigation had come under criticism for failing to conduct a thorough search of Rock Creek Park in 2001. Years later, the prosecution's reliance on a prison informant with a questionable history ultimately undermined the case's foundation. Guandique's deportation effectively ended his involvement in the U.S. legal system. He faced no further charges related to Levy's death, and U.S. authorities did not pursue extradition or additional investigations involving him. His name, once central to the high-profile case, faded from public view following his return to El Salvador. Meanwhile, the question of who killed Chandra Levy remained unanswered. The case, once thought closed, returned to the status of an open homicide investigation. The D.C. Metropolitan Police Department stated it would continue to pursue leads, but no new suspect was publicly identified. With the passage of time, the trail grew colder, and no new forensic breakthroughs emerged. The legal closure of the case against Guandique left a void. No resolution, no new direction, only the enduring mystery surrounding the final moments of Chandra Levy's life. The dismissal of charges against Ingmar Guandique in 2016 marked a profound turning point in the Chandra Levy case, not only for law enforcement, but for the public and the Levy family. With the case once again officially open and no suspect in custody, a wave of renewed questions surfaced, none more pressing than, who killed Chandra Levy? The original investigation had endured criticism from its earliest days. Despite computer evidence pointing toward Rock Creek Park, the initial search of the area had been limited and failed to locate her remains. When her body was eventually discovered by a passerby a year later, it exposed serious flaws in the investigative approach. The oversight was a painful reminder of missed opportunities. Compounding those concerns were the shifting focuses of the investigation over time. The media spotlight on Congressman Gary Condit had dramatically shaped public perception, yet law enforcement never formally identified him as a suspect. Condit had been eliminated based on his alibi and lack of physical evidence. Years later, his political career remained tarnished despite his exclusion from the final case against Guandique. The reliance on jailhouse informant testimony during Guandique's trial further raised doubts about the reliability of the conviction. Morales's credibility had always been in question, and the later revelations about inconsistencies in his account ultimately led to the collapse of the prosecution's case. This dependence on a single, uncorroborated source underlined systemic challenges in prosecuting cold cases. The Levy family, steadfast in their pursuit of justice, continued to advocate for answers. They called for renewed investigative efforts and more transparent communication from authorities. Publicly, they expressed deep disappointment, but remained committed to keeping Chandra's story alive. Their hope was that advances in forensic science, or the emergence of new witnesses, might one day lead to a break in the case. Law enforcement kept the case open, but progress was slow. Over the years, detectives occasionally revisited leads or re-examined evidence, but nothing conclusive emerged. The passage of time only made resolution more difficult. Witnesses became harder to locate, and memories faded. The Chandra Levy case, once a national obsession, faded from headlines but remained an emblematic example of the complexities of high-profile investigations. With no conclusive answers, the mystery endured, haunting a city, frustrating investigators, and leaving a family in a state of unresolved grief. The disappearance and murder of Chandra Levy left a lasting imprint on American society, on how law enforcement investigates missing persons, how media handles high-profile cases, and how personal tragedy can intersect with public life. More than 2 decades after her death, the case remains unsolved, yet its legacy continues to shape discourse and policy. In the world of journalism, the Levy case became a benchmark for the ethics of media coverage. Early reporting focused heavily on her relationship with Congressman Gary Condit, often overshadowing the broader investigative failures and the search for facts. The intense media focus on scandal rather than evidence set off a national conversation about responsible reporting. Critics argued that sensationalism had clouded public perception and diverted attention from more substantive leads in the investigation. In politics, the impact was direct and enduring. Although Condit was never charged or named a suspect, his perceived lack of transparency damaged his political standing irreparably. He lost his congressional seat in 2002 and never regained public trust. The case underscored how personal associations, even when legally irrelevant, can carry significant political consequences. For law enforcement, the investigation became a cautionary tale. The failure to thoroughly search Rock Creek Park, despite early clues from Levy's computer, led to criticism of police procedures in handling missing adult cases. In response, some jurisdictions reassessed their protocols, emphasizing the importance of prompt and comprehensive search efforts, especially when digital evidence points to specific locations. The Levy family's advocacy also played a role in raising awareness about the challenges families face when a loved one goes missing. Their persistent calls for answers and accountability helped spotlight the emotional toll and procedural gaps in such cases. Chandra's parents became voices in national conversations about victims' rights and investigative reform. Over time, the Chandra Levy case has come to represent the intersection of modern investigative limits and public expectations. Despite advances in technology, the case remains open, a reminder that even the most widely followed investigations can end without resolution. It also serves as a reference point for comparing how similar cases are handled today, with greater scrutiny on both media practices and investigative methods. While the question of who killed Chandra Levy remains unanswered, her story has not faded. Her name continues to evoke a complex narrative of ambition, tragedy, and the pursuit of justice in the public eye, one that endures even in absence of closure. On the morning of November 19, 1988, the city of Hayward, California, stirred to life under a crisp autumn sky. 9-year-old Michaela Joy Garrett, a lively fourth grader at Hillview Crest Elementary School, was spending the day with her best friend. The two girls were inseparable, their friendship marked by shared secrets and carefree afternoons spent riding scooters around their quiet neighborhood in the unincorporated area of Fremont. That Saturday began like many others. Michaela and her friend had plans to visit the nearby Rainbow Market, a small corner store located on Mission Boulevard, to buy snacks. It was a short ride from Michaela's home, just 2 blocks away, a distance that, in the eyes of a child, felt both thrilling and entirely safe. With coins jingling in their pockets and laughter echoing between them, the girls set off, riding their scooters with the ease of routine. At approximately 10:15 a.m., they reached the store, parked their scooters by the entrance, and stepped inside to purchase treats. The store clerk remembered them as polite and cheerful, like any pair of children excited to enjoy their weekend. After completing their purchases, the girls walked outside. It was then that they noticed something was wrong. Michaela's scooter had been moved. It was now positioned near a parked car, a tan-colored, older model sedan with dull paint and cluttered seats. Michaela approached the scooter to retrieve it. As she bent down, a man emerged from the car. Without warning, he grabbed Michaela from behind, dragging her into the vehicle in full view of her friend. The abduction happened in seconds. The friend would later recall the man as being in his 20s, with shoulder-length dirty blonde hair, possibly curled or wavy, and a pockmarked face. He wore a white t-shirt and jeans. As the car sped away, turning onto Mission Boulevard and vanishing into traffic, Michaela's friend ran back into the store, screaming for help. The store clerk immediately called 911. Police arrived within minutes, but the vehicle and Michaela were gone. Back at home, Michaela's mother, Sharon Murch, received the phone call every parent dreads. She raced to the scene, her world unraveling with each passing moment. Officers began canvassing the area, collecting statements, and alerting local patrol units. A bolo, "Be on the lookout," was issued for the suspect vehicle, but no immediate leads materialized. The Rainbow Market's parking lot was soon swarming with police, journalists, and neighbors. The shocking nature of the abduction, committed in broad daylight, in front of a witness, gripped the community. Flyers bearing Michaela's photos circulated rapidly. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting Michaela's image across the Bay Area. Despite the swift response, Michaela was gone. The small scooter left at the edge of the parking lot became a haunting symbol, both of her innocence and of the violence that had shattered it. As night fell over Hayward, law enforcement began what would become one of the most extensive and enduring missing child investigations in California history. Michaela's disappearance was now more than a family's nightmare. It was a community's crisis. The moments following Michaela Garrick's abduction were marked by chaos, fear, and urgency. Her friend, traumatized but lucid, provided a detailed account to responding officers. She described the man's sudden appearance and the terrifying moment he seized Michaela, pulling her into the car. Her description became the cornerstone of the initial suspect profile, a white male in his 20s, with a thin build, approximately 6 feet tall, pockmarked complexion, and dirty blonde or light brown hair. The abduction vehicle was described as an older model sedan, possibly a 1970s or early 1980s model, boxy and dull in color. Some witnesses recalled it as tan or gold. Inside, the car appeared cluttered. This detail was significant. It suggested a vehicle used regularly for living or travel, potentially hinting at a transient lifestyle. Police rapidly sealed off the area surrounding the Rainbow Market. Officers gathered surveillance footage from nearby businesses, though in 1988, such systems were rare and typically low quality. No usable images of the abduction or the car were recovered. The scooter, a key piece of evidence, was collected and examined, though it yielded no immediate forensic leads. Michaela's mother, Sharon Murch, arrived at the scene not long after police. Her presence underscored the human toll of the incident. She stood beside officers, fielding questions, clinging to hope while confronting the incomprehensible reality that her daughter had been taken in broad daylight. Law enforcement initiated a widespread alert. Roadblocks were established at key intersections in and around Hayward. The California Highway Patrol issued a state bulletin, and neighboring counties were informed. Volunteers quickly mobilized, distributing thousands of flyers. Michaela's smiling face and distinctive blonde hair were soon posted in store windows, libraries, and gas stations from the Bay Area to the Central Valley. News of the abduction spread rapidly. Local television stations led with the story on their evening broadcasts. Within hours, the case drew regional attention, aided by the rarity and brazenness of the kidnapping. Parents were gripped with fear. Community members offered tips, some sincere, others speculative, and investigators followed up on every lead. The eyewitness account allowed police to produce a composite sketch of the suspect. The image, showing a young man with shaggy hair and a lean face, was widely circulated. Several individuals resembling the sketch were questioned, but none led to a break in the case. The abduction's swiftness and the lack of physical evidence left investigators with little to work from. By nightfall, Michaela had been missing for nearly 12 hours. Despite the scale of the search and the volume of tips, no confirmed sightings were reported. Authorities began to fear the worst, that the abductor had successfully evaded the initial dragnet and could be far from the Bay Area. Over the following days, the Hayward Police Department expanded their efforts. Helicopters scanned nearby hills and ravines. Canine units combed through nearby wooded areas. Waterways and industrial zones were searched. A hotline was established to receive tips, and reward money was offered for information leading to Michaela's return. In these early hours and days, the investigation took on a race against time quality. National outlets picked up the story, and Michaela's face appeared on major networks. The case was quickly entered into the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's database. Though local leads were sparse, her name became part of a growing network of child abduction alerts nationwide. But despite the urgency, despite the scale of the search, no trace of Michaela or the suspect vehicle was found. In the days following Michaela Garrick's disappearance, the Hayward community found itself united by grief and fear. Vigils sprang up throughout the city. Yellow ribbons were tied to trees and light poles, and handmade posters bearing Michaela's image appeared in every storefront. At her school, students and teachers struggled to process the absence of a classmate whose laughter had once filled the playground. Law enforcement escalated the case rapidly. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the investigation within the first 24 hours. Michaela's case was now national. Her photo was sent to law enforcement agencies across the United States. Tip lines were flooded. Hundreds of leads poured in from across California and beyond. Detectives, working around the clock, divided the tips into categories: credible sightings, suspicious persons, and potential vehicle matches. Michaela's mother, Sharon, became a public figure almost overnight. Appearing on television and in press conferences, she pleaded for her daughter's safe return. Her presence added a deeply human element to the case, reminding viewers that this was not just a news story, it was a personal tragedy unfolding in real time. She maintained hope, driven by belief in her daughter's resilience and the community's support. Media outlets gave the story prominent coverage. The Bay Area's major newspapers ran daily articles. Televised updates became routine, especially as investigators tried to maintain public attention. Local news anchors interviewed police officers, psychologists, and volunteers, all of whom speculated cautiously while emphasizing the need for information. Flyers continued to circulate, now reaching into Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona. Truckers posted them at rest stops. Airlines and bus terminals were asked to remain alert. The composite sketch was printed in national publications. The campaign was one of the most intensive seen in the state at the time for a non-family abduction. Volunteers coordinated search parties that scoured fields, abandoned buildings, and remote trails. The terrain around Hayward, with its urban sprawl bordered by hills and open land, made the effort especially daunting. Still, people came, sometimes in the hundreds, to look for any sign of Michaela or her abductor. Authorities maintained a command center to coordinate the growing operation. Despite the energy and resources being poured into the investigation, the case seemed to stagnate. Tips were investigated and cleared. Suspect interviews yielded no arrests. Every day without a lead was a blow to the momentum that had initially galvanized the community. Law enforcement began examining known sex offenders in the area. Dozens of interviews were conducted with individuals fitting the general description of the suspect. One man, who bore a passing resemblance to the sketch, was questioned extensively, but no evidence linked him to the crime. Authorities expressed frustration. The kidnapping had been bold and visible, and yet the suspect had vanished without a trace. As the initial shock began to subside, the emotional toll deepened. At Michaela's school, counselors were brought in to speak with students. Teachers left Michaela's desk untouched. Letters and cards from around the country began arriving at the Garrick household. Strangers sent prayers, poems, and stories. Some claimed psychic visions. Others offered help or theories. Most simply wanted to show support. Through it all, Sharon remained resolute. She attended press briefings, responded to letters, and met with law enforcement regularly. Her visibility became crucial in keeping public attention on the case. She reminded the world that Michaela was more than a headline. She was a daughter, a friend, a child who had been taken, and who still needed to be found. But time moved on, and as days turned to weeks, the sense of urgency was slowly replaced by quiet dread. There were no witnesses beyond Michaela's friend. No further sightings. No communication from a kidnapper. Investigators started to confront the possibility that Michaela had been taken far from Hayward, or worse. Still, the community hoped. So did her family. In homes and precincts alike, people clung to the belief that someone, somewhere, would come forward with a piece of information that would bring Michaela home. As weeks turned into months, the investigation into Michaela Garrick's abduction shifted from an urgent manhunt to a long-term missing person case. The initial wave of tips and leads had dried up. Detectives, still assigned full-time to the case, began reevaluating every detail of the crime scene and revisiting early witness statements. The composite sketch remained a central tool. Officers displayed it during interviews and public appeals, hoping it might trigger a memory or identify someone who had recently arrived, or disappeared, from the area. Behavioral analysts provided insight into the abductor's likely psychological profile. He was likely someone who could blend into society, avoid drawing suspicion, and had likely offended before. Attention turned to other cases. Detectives reviewed similar child abduction reports across California. In some instances, individuals were brought in for questioning due to similarities in victim age, location, or suspect appearance. In several cases, convicted sex offenders in the region were interrogated and their alibis for the day of Michaela's disappearance thoroughly vetted. Yet no concrete connections were made. The lack of forensic evidence remained a barrier. The scooter yielded no fingerprints that could be matched to known offenders. The suspect's car had not been recovered, and with only a vague description and no license plate, locating it was akin to finding a needle in a haystack. Investigators broadened their focus to include individuals living transient lifestyles. Motels, shelters, and vehicle encampments were visited. Missing persons databases were cross-referenced. Although the suspect's identity eluded them, authorities maintained Michaela's case as a high priority. Over time, a few individuals emerged as persons of interest. One man, arrested for unrelated charges in a nearby county, drew attention because of his appearance and criminal history. Detectives traveled to interview him, reviewing his movements during November 1988. However, no evidence linked him to Michaela. Another tip led investigators to a man who had left California shortly after the abduction, but he, too, was cleared after thorough investigation. Public interest in the case remained strong, thanks in part to the persistence of Michaela's family. Sharon Murch continued to speak out, never allowing her daughter's name to fade from the public eye. Her appeals kept the case alive in national consciousness. The media revisited the story on anniversaries and when new cases bore resemblance to Michaela's. As technology progressed in the 1990s and 2000s, the case files were digitized and preserved. Evidence from the scene, including Michaela's scooter and physical records, were stored under controlled conditions in the hope that future advancements might extract useful forensic data. The police department also began consulting with external experts, criminal profilers, forensic analysts, and retired detectives, seeking fresh perspectives on the now cold case. Despite these efforts, the investigation remained stalled. Each new lead brought renewed hope but ultimately ended in disappointment. Families of missing children often speak of a slow emotional erosion, the constant rise and fall of hope. For Michaela's family, this became an enduring reality. There were no confessions, no ransom demands, no sightings. The silence was absolute. Still, the case remained open. Investigators checked for updates when new technology emerged. DNA testing and database matching, which were becoming more advanced, were applied where possible. Law enforcement continued to hold out hope that time, technology, or a slip by the abductor would one day break the silence. The community's memory did not fade. Each year, on the anniversary of Michaela's disappearance, local papers printed her photo. Candlelight vigils continued, with friends, neighbors, and supporters gathering to mark the time passed and reaffirm their commitment to finding her. Michaela's name became synonymous with the broader national conversation about missing children, abduction prevention, and the importance of long-term case persistence. The search for Michaela had not ended, it had simply changed shape. The 1990s passed with no resolution in Michaela Garrick's case. The world changed, but her photo remained in circulation, on missing persons posters, in media retrospectives, and on the wall of the Hayward Police Department's investigative division. Every few years, renewed media interest brought temporary momentum, often sparked by a similar case or an anniversary. Still, the case remained unsolved. Her family never stopped searching. Sharon Murch wrote letters to her daughter, published updates, and interacted with other families affected by child abductions. She developed a public presence dedicated to keeping Michaela's memory alive. Her message remained clear: Michaela was loved, missed, and never forgotten. She refused to let the case be reduced to a file on a shelf. Over time, advancements in forensic science introduced new possibilities. In the early 2000s, DNA testing became more reliable and widely available. The evidence collected in 1988, limited by the standards of the time, was re-examined using these tools. Still, no DNA profile had been obtained from the crime scene that could be matched to a suspect. Investigators hoped that if one ever became available, national databases would provide the breakthrough they had long awaited. The years brought a series of false leads. Several individuals falsely confessed to involvement in Michaela's abduction. Each confession required a full investigation. In every instance, the stories fell apart under scrutiny, details didn't match, timelines couldn't be confirmed, and no physical evidence supported their claims. Yet each incident drained resources and reopened wounds for her family. At various points, Michaela's case was linked in theory to other disappearances. One notable example was J.C. Dugard, who had been abducted in 1991 from South Lake Tahoe and miraculously recovered in 2009. Dugard's rescue reignited public interest in long-term abduction cases, including Michaela's. Investigators carefully compared case files, suspect lists, and geographic data. Despite similarities, no connection was established. In another instance, the case of Philip Garrido, Dugard's abductor, prompted authorities to search properties for evidence related to Michaela. A thorough excavation was conducted at a location in the East Bay, but no evidence was found. The investigation into Garrido yielded no links to Michaela. The disappointment that followed these efforts became a familiar pattern. As Michaela would have grown into adulthood, age progression photos were developed and released to the public. These images aimed to depict what she might look like as a teenager, then a young woman. Experts used family photos, sibling features, and computer algorithms to produce realistic representations. These updates were shared widely, including through national missing children's networks. Despite the lack of new evidence, the case was never considered closed. Detectives continued to work on it intermittently, returning to old notes, reconsidering early assumptions, and keeping open lines with anyone who might come forward. A core group of investigators, even if reassigned to other cases, retained a personal commitment to finding answers. The emotional burden of uncertainty was compounded by time. For the Garrick family, there was no closure, no place to grieve, no definitive point at which to say goodbye. They navigated birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries with a persistent ache. Every phone call brought a flicker of hope, every knock at the door, a moment of held breath. Michaela remained suspended in time, forever 9 years old, forever missing. The community around Hayward evolved, but memory of Michaela lingered. New residents learned of her story from neighbors and news articles. community vigils continued. The Hayward Police Department held annual acknowledgments of her case. Each event included renewed calls for information and updates on the ongoing status of the investigation. Michaela's story had become emblematic, not just of one child's disappearance, but of the enduring impact such tragedies leave behind. Her name evoked not just loss, but resilience. Her family's unwavering advocacy inspired others facing similar circumstances. And while the answers remained elusive, the search did not end. Hope endured. Quiet, persistent, and unyielding. By the late 2010s, Michaela Garrick's case remained officially open but unsolved. Her disappearance had become a fixture in the annals of California's missing person cases. Yet behind the scenes, technological progress and shifts in investigative strategies were reshaping cold case work. DNA analysis, which had evolved significantly over the decades, was beginning to unlock answers in long-dormant investigations. Among the preserved evidence from 1988 was a partial palm print lifted from Michaela's scooter. For years, it had remained unmatched in law enforcement databases. Earlier forensic technology had been unable to process or connect such partial prints with a high degree of confidence. But with the introduction of new analytical tools, especially automated latent print matching systems and enhanced digital imaging, the Hayward Police Department decided to resubmit the print for renewed analysis. At the same time, the department was collaborating with state forensic agencies to review a broader list of cold cases with potentially overlapping details. These efforts involved not just reanalyzing evidence but revisiting old witness statements, suspect lists, and physical descriptions. The hope was that technology could now bridge gaps that human memory and traditional investigation could not. Then, in 2020, over 3 decades after Michaela's disappearance, forensic scientists made a match. The palm print from the scooter was positively identified as belonging to David Emery Mish, a convicted killer already serving a prison sentence for a 1989 murder. Mish's name had not surfaced during the original investigation. He was unknown to the Garrick family and had not been previously linked to child abductions. However, records confirmed he had been in the East Bay Area at the time of Michaela's abduction. With the match in hand, investigators began a quiet and thorough re-examination of Mish's background. They reviewed his criminal history, prior arrests, known associates, and any movements around November 1988. The pieces began to align. Though circumstantial, a growing body of evidence suggested that Mish had both the opportunity and capacity to carry out the crime. Hayward detectives coordinated with Alameda County prosecutors and the FBI to ensure the investigation adhered to proper legal procedures. They conducted interviews with former acquaintances and examined additional evidence in connection with Mish's prior convictions. The process was meticulous. After years of disappointment, authorities knew they could not afford a misstep. By December 2020, prosecutors announced that David Mish had been charged with the murder of Michaela Garrick. Though her remains had never been found, the strength of the forensic evidence and the circumstances surrounding the abduction led officials to formally declare her case a homicide. The palm print, left on the scooter Michaela had reached for moments before she was taken, had become the key. For Sharon Murch, the news was both devastating and clarifying. It marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, one in which hope gave way to truth and memory merged with grief. She spoke publicly, acknowledging the years of uncertainty and the cruel reality that Michaela would not be coming home. The announcement of the charges brought a flurry of media attention. News outlets across the country revisited the details of Michaela's abduction. Community members expressed a mixture of relief and sorrow. For those who had searched fields and distributed flyers, the name David Mish was unfamiliar, but the resolution he brought was undeniably real. In law enforcement circles, the case was cited as a testament to the importance of preserving evidence and investing in forensic science. The partial palm print, once overlooked and unmatched, had become the thread that unraveled a mystery more than 3 decades old. Investigators emphasized that without continued advancements in fingerprint identification systems, the link to Mish might never have been discovered. Though justice remained incomplete, no trial had yet been held, no confession obtained, the identification of a suspect marked a turning point. Michaela's story had entered a new phase. The unanswered questions had not vanished, but one of the greatest unknowns, who had taken her, had finally been confronted with evidence. On December 21, 2020, more than 32 years after Michaela Garrick disappeared from a parking lot in Hayward, California, prosecutors formally charged David Emery Mish with her murder. The decision was the result of a lengthy and methodical review of physical evidence, centered around the forensic match of a palm print lifted from Michaela's scooter. Mish, already incarcerated for an unrelated homicide committed in 1989, was in state prison at the time the charges were filed. He had been serving a sentence for the murder of a woman in the Fremont area, which took place just months after Michaela's abduction. His history of violent crime, combined with the forensic link, gave prosecutors a compelling foundation to bring charges. The arrest announcement was made during a press conference held by the Alameda County District Attorney's Office and the Hayward Police Department. Officials described the significance of the breakthrough and provided a brief overview of the evidence. They emphasized that while the case remained without a recovered body or eyewitness identification of Mish, the palm print was a unique and decisive piece of physical proof. David Mish did not respond publicly to the charges. His criminal record included multiple violent offenses, and he had previously been named a suspect in other unsolved cases. Law enforcement now began revisiting those files to examine whether other incidents might be connected. At the time of Michaela's abduction, Mish lived in the East Bay and had the freedom to travel throughout the region. For Sharon Murch and her family, the identification of a suspect brought a deep emotional reckoning. They had spent decades living in the uncertainty of not knowing what happened to Michaela. Now, that uncertainty had taken shape in the form of a single name. Sharon acknowledged the complexity of the moment. There was no joy in confirmation, only the quiet weight of truth finally surfaced. With the charges filed, legal proceedings began to move forward. Mish was formally arraigned and entered a plea of not guilty. The prosecution stated their intent to pursue a strong case, grounded in forensic evidence, and supported by the consistency of witness accounts and known timelines. While the process promised to be lengthy, it represented the first formal opportunity for Michaela's family to seek justice. Law enforcement continued their investigation into Mish's activities before and after November 1988. They sought to reconstruct his movements, associates, and behavior during the time period. Detectives revisited past statements from witnesses who had described a man matching Mish's appearance near the scene. Though none had identified him by name at the time, comparisons now suggested potential alignment. Additional forensic testing was conducted on archived materials. Investigators hoped that newer techniques might reveal further connections between Mish and the crime. They also examined his possessions and previous residences, looking for any object or record that might corroborate his involvement in Michaela's abduction. Public response to the arrest was somber. Many who had followed the case for decades expressed relief that an arrest had been made, tempered by the realization that Michaela had likely died shortly after her disappearance. Community members recalled the vigils, the flyers, and the endless hope that she might one day return. Now, that hope had given way to mourning. The legal process inched forward, with preliminary hearings and motions scheduled. Defense attorneys began reviewing discovery material. Prosecutors prepared to present the full case, balancing public interest with the need to ensure a fair and thorough trial. The justice system was now tasked with addressing a crime that had remained unresolved for more than 30 years. For Sharon and those who loved Michaela, the arrest did not offer closure, but it did offer clarity. After years of speculation, of theories and false confessions, they now had a name, a man whose actions had irrevocably altered their lives. The long pursuit of truth had finally revealed a path forward. Following David Mish's arrest in 2020, the case entered the legal system, bringing new scrutiny and procedural demands. Mish, housed in a state prison at the time, was transferred for arraignment in Alameda County, where he appeared before the court and entered a plea of not guilty. The courtroom was subdued. Media representatives filled the gallery, and legal observers monitored closely, recognizing the historic weight of the proceedings. The charges, kidnapping and murder, were based on circumstantial and forensic evidence. The partial palm print on Michaela's scooter was central to the prosecution's case. Additional support came from the timeline of Mish's known whereabouts and criminal history, which placed him in the East Bay at the time of Michaela's disappearance. Prosecutors described the print as in a location consistent with the abduction, giving it critical evidentiary value. In pretrial motions, defense attorneys challenged the sufficiency of the evidence, noting the absence of eyewitness identification or physical remains. They argued that the time elapsed since the crime created challenges in ensuring a fair trial. However, prosecutors countered that the print, combined with witness descriptions and the context of Mish's known criminal conduct, constituted strong grounds to proceed. Legal analysts recognized the case as complex. While forensic breakthroughs had increasingly led to charges in long unsolved crimes, prosecutions based solely on such evidence without a body remained rare. The passage of time posed challenges to both sides. Memories fade, documents become harder to locate, and witnesses move or pass away. Yet the emotional and symbolic importance of the case kept it firmly in the public eye. For Michaela's family, the legal developments reopened wounds long endured. Sharon Murch monitored proceedings with quiet resolve. She attended hearings when possible and released statements acknowledging the gravity of the moment. The process was not only legal, it was personal. The man accused of taking her daughter was now facing the very system that had sought him for over 3 decades. Public reaction was measured. Community members expressed support for Michaela's family and hoped that justice would finally be served. Longtime residents remembered the search efforts, the vigils, and the photographs of Michaela posted in store windows and bus stops. Many found solace in the idea that science and persistence had finally delivered an answer, even if late. National media once again covered the case, now focusing on the legal process. The arrest of David Mish was discussed in the context of evolving forensic technologies and the enduring nature of cold case investigations. Michaela's name returned to headlines, not as a symbol of loss alone, but as a case where progress had finally been made. Inside the courtroom, legal teams prepared for a trial that would likely include expert testimony on fingerprint identification, historical timelines, and criminal profiling. The prosecution planned to establish a narrative grounded in the evidence, while the defense would challenge gaps in the investigation and the lack of direct links beyond the palm print. As the case advanced through preliminary hearings, delays were inevitable. The COVID-19 pandemic, ongoing at the time, complicated scheduling and introduced new legal protocols. Hearings were postponed, documents were exchanged electronically, and in-person proceedings were restricted. Still, the case moved forward, slowly but steadily. Law enforcement officials used the renewed attention to appeal for additional information. They encouraged anyone who may have known Mish in the late 1980s to come forward, hoping that new witnesses or forgotten details might emerge. Investigators also explored whether Mish could be linked to other unsolved crimes, reviewing cold case files from across the state. For many observers, the the arrest and ensuing legal process marked a shift from searching to reckoning. Michaela's case, once characterized by uncertainty and unanswered questions, was now poised for judicial resolution. While conviction was not guaranteed, the mere existence of a courtroom proceeding signaled a long-awaited step toward accountability. As the legal process moved ahead, the memory of Michaela continued to resonate far beyond Hayward. Her case had shaped public policy, community awareness, and the lives of countless individuals who had followed her story. Now, those years of uncertainty were yielding to a process aimed at justice, even if long delayed. More than 3 decades after Michaela Garrick vanished from a Hayward parking lot, the case that had haunted a community and defined a family's grief entered its final phase, the pursuit of justice through the courts. Yet, even as legal proceedings began, the sense of finality remained elusive. Michaela's body had never been found, and questions about the exact events of November 19, 1988, continued to linger. David Misch remained in custody, facing multiple murder charges, including those in unrelated cases. While the prosecution prepared to present its evidence in Michaela's case, they also navigated the complexities of trying a suspect with a long criminal history. Misch's background included a documented pattern of violence, raising the stakes for a case built largely on forensic linkage. Court proceedings advanced incrementally. Pretrial motions, evidentiary hearings, and scheduling delays pushed the anticipated trial date further. The case, though public, operated under the strict procedures of the legal system. Attorneys filed briefs, contested admissibility of evidence, and arranged witness lists. At each stage, Michaela's name remained at the center of attention. For her mother, Sharon Murch, the process remained a test of endurance. She continued to attend hearings, read court filings, and speak with law enforcement. She maintained an online presence, updating those who had supported her for decades. Her focus had shifted, not only to achieving justice for Michaela, but also to ensuring that her daughter's memory was preserved with dignity and clarity. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies continued to explore potential links between Misch and other unsolved cases. The hope was that Michaela's case, now active in court, might yield further connections. Detectives reviewed old files and examined cold case logs. Any additional evidence of Misch's activities could help reinforce the pattern of behavior prosecutors aimed to present. Public interest in the case remained steady. News reports covered each legal development. Crime documentary programs revisited Michaela's story, framing it within the broader context of advancements in forensic science and the long arc of justice. The palm print, once just a fragment of evidence, had become a symbol of perseverance in investigative work. As the trial approached, the possibility of closure loomed. Yet for Michaela's family, true closure remained beyond reach. Without answers to key questions, where Michaela was taken, how she was killed, and why she was targeted, there could be no complete resolution. The trial might deliver accountability, but it would not bring Michaela back. Still, the courtroom became a place where Michaela's story could be formally told. Prosecutors prepared to lay out the timeline, the evidence, and the suspect's profile before a judge and jury. The defense would challenge the narrative, emphasizing the absence of a body and the limitations of forensic certainty. The outcome was not guaranteed, but the process itself marked progress. In Hayward and beyond, Michaela's case influenced how law enforcement approached missing child investigations. Her story became part of training sessions, awareness campaigns, and advocacy programs. The principles that emerged, evidence preservation, public engagement, and the value of long-term commitment, were taught to new generations of investigators. Today, Michaela Garrick's name endures. It is spoken in remembrance ceremonies, printed in law enforcement materials, and held in the hearts of those who followed her story. The scooter she reached for that day remains the most tangible remnant of her presence, a silent witness to a life interrupted but never forgotten. Her case stands as both a tragedy and a lesson. It reminds us of the resilience of those who seek justice, the importance of persistence in the face of uncertainty, and the enduring human drive to uncover truth. As long as Michaela's name is remembered, her story continues, etched in the memory of a community, and in the long, determined pursuit of justice. Christina May Tina Thomas was born on February 13, 1977, in West Germany. Adopted by Tommy and Cindy Thomas, she grew up in the United States, eventually settling in Alabama. Tina pursued her education at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where she met David Gabriel Gabe Watson in 2001. Their relationship blossomed, leading to their engagement and subsequent marriage on October 11, 2003. For their honeymoon, the couple chose Australia, a destination known for its vibrant marine life and renowned diving spots. Both Tina and Gabe were certified scuba divers. However, their experience levels differed significantly. Gabe had completed approximately 55 dives, primarily in freshwater environments, while Tina had recently obtained her certification and had limited diving experience. The couple planned a dive at the SS Yongala wreck, located off the coast of Townsville, Queensland. The Yongala, a passenger ship that sank in 1911, rests about 30 meters below the surface and is considered one of the world's premier wreck dive sites. Despite its allure, the site is known for its challenging conditions, including strong currents and limited visibility. On October 22, 2003, Tina and Gabe joined a group of divers aboard the vessel Spolsport for the excursion to the Yongala wreck. The dive was to be unguided, a decision that would later draw scrutiny given Tina's limited experience and the site's demanding conditions. As the couple descended into the depths, they were surrounded by the remnants of the Yongala, now home to a myriad of marine species. However, the dive took a tragic turn when Tina lost consciousness and sank to the ocean floor. Despite rescue efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. On the morning of October 22, 2003, weather conditions off the Queensland coast were clear but breezy. Tina and Gabe Watson boarded the Spolsport, operated by Mike Ball Dive Expeditions, along with other tourists and diving enthusiasts. The primary attraction was the SS Yongala, a popular but technically challenging wreck site resting on the seabed about 33 meters deep. The dive was set up without a personal guide for each pair. Although Gabe had logged dozens of dives, most were in calmer, freshwater lakes. Tina had recently completed her basic open water certification and was diving in open ocean conditions for the first time. Before entering the water, Tina expressed nervousness. Some divers later recalled her hesitance and uncertainty with the equipment. The couple entered the water and began their descent. Witnesses later described the current as strong that day, typical for the Yongala but strenuous for an inexperienced diver. The group dispersed as each pair headed toward the wreck. Gabe and Tina were observed together near the descent line but not tethered to a guide rope or one another. Approximately 2 minutes into the dive, other divers noticed Tina beginning to struggle. One diver saw Gabe swimming toward the surface while Tina was sinking, motionless. Another diver found Tina lying face up on the ocean floor, her regulator dislodged. Emergency assistance was summoned immediately. She was brought to the surface and transferred back to the Spolsport, where CPR was attempted, but she was pronounced dead shortly after. Back on the boat, Gabe gave an initial account of the incident, claiming that Tina had panicked, knocked his mask and regulator loose, and that he had briefly lost control. He stated he tried to assist, but eventually had to surface for his own safety. The dive instructor and other passengers questioned the logic of his decision not to attempt a rescue or alert others sooner. Dive computer data and accounts from other divers quickly raised further questions. Records showed that Gabe had been underwater for a brief duration, much shorter than most others. Tina's dive profile suggested a rapid descent and little movement afterward. In the controlled environment of the dive boat, emergency protocols were reviewed and followed, but the crew noted inconsistencies in Gabe's explanation, particularly the nature of Tina's distress and his failure to use the instructor's immediate assistance. What should have been the highlight of a honeymoon ended in tragedy, and the circumstances of Tina's death quickly prompted questions about whether it was a mere accident or something more. As the Spolsport turned back toward Townsville, a somber silence settled over the dive boat. Crew members and passengers tried to process the tragedy that had just unfolded. Tina Watson's body lay secured on board, wrapped respectfully in a blanket. Gabe Watson remained seated in relative silence, only occasionally speaking with crew or authorities. Witnesses later recalled his behavior as calm but distant, a detail that would later become part of the broader investigation. Upon docking, Queensland police took statements from the dive crew, passengers, and Gabe. Initial observations were logged meticulously. Several divers recounted seeing Tina separated from Gabe during the descent. One diver stated she saw Gabe ascending while Tina sank. Another described how Tina appeared unresponsive on the ocean floor, with her regulator dislodged and bubbles escaping from her mouth. Emergency medical personnel met the boat and confirmed what had already been determined on board. Tina had died during the dive. Her body was transferred to a local hospital for examination. Gabe, meanwhile, was questioned further. His account remained that Tina panicked early into the dive, grabbed at him, and knocked his mask and regulator, causing him to lose control. He claimed he attempted to assist her briefly before choosing to ascend for his safety. Authorities began evaluating the physical evidence. Tina's dive gear was collected and examined. Her buoyancy control device, BCD, was functional, but set in a way that didn't aid in an emergency ascent. Her weights had not been ditched, a common self-rescue action for a diver in trouble. Her air supply still held a significant amount of air. These details complicated the notion of a simple panic-driven drowning. Back in Alabama, news of Tina's death reached her family quickly. Shocked and devastated, they began pressing for details. Her father, Tommy Thomas, in particular, expressed deep concern about the circumstances and Gabe's account. Tina's parents were immediately struck by perceived inconsistencies and gaps in Gabe's narrative. Within days, the Queensland coroner began assembling the investigative file, drawing from police reports, dive computer data, and witness statements. While Gabe returned home to the U.S. soon after, Australian authorities were already considering the possibility that Tina's death may not have been accidental. What followed was an extensive, multi-year investigation that sought to determine whether the events of that dive were the result of panic, negligence, or something far more deliberate. In the weeks following Tina Watson's death, Australian authorities continued gathering evidence. The coroner's office requested a detailed forensic analysis of Tina's equipment and reviewed her dive profile, which indicated an unusually rapid descent followed by minimal movement. Autopsy results confirmed she had drowned, but the condition of her body did not indicate a violent struggle. Yet several inconsistencies in Gabe's account raised concerns. Gabe had described Tina as panicking and grabbing at him, causing him to abort the dive. But dive experts noted that his actions were inconsistent with standard rescue practices. Gabe was a certified rescue diver, trained specifically to handle underwater emergencies. The decision to abandon Tina and ascend rather than inflate her BCD or remove her weights for buoyancy contradicted that training. Questions also arose about why he did not immediately seek help from the dive instructor, who was nearby and assisting other divers. As police reviewed video footage from earlier dives on the trip, Gabe was seen frequently monitoring Tina and adjusting her gear. actions some viewed as overly controlling, while others interpreted them as protective. Yet during the fatal dive, he claimed she panicked suddenly, without warning, and he could not stop her descent. Further scrutiny turned to Gabe's behavior after Tina's death. On returning to Alabama, he filed a life insurance claim that had been recently updated before their honeymoon. Though it was never paid out, the move deepened suspicions. Tina's father, Tommy Thomas, began sharing his concerns publicly, alleging that Gabe's account didn't match the evidence and witness statements. Authorities also uncovered a short but troubling history of Gabe pressuring Tina to change beneficiaries on life and travel insurance policies in the months before the trip. Tina reportedly confided in friends and family that she was uneasy with some of the demands being made. She had refused to change one of her life insurance policies, citing discomfort over the request. The case soon attracted attention from Australian and American media. The narrative of a newlywed drowning on her honeymoon was compelling, and as inconsistencies in Gabe's version of events emerged, public interest deepened. Questions about his motives, actions during the dive, and conduct afterward kept the case alive in headlines. The Queensland Police continued to build their file, eventually referring it to the state coroner for formal review. Meanwhile, Tina's family pushed for legal action, convinced that what happened on the Yongala dive site was not an accident. The pressure mounted on investigators to determine whether there was enough evidence to move forward with a prosecution. By early 2004, the Queensland State Coroner's Office had compiled extensive material on Tina Watson's death. Investigators conducted interviews with dive instructors, other tourists, and experts in dive safety. Tina's dive computer, retrieved and analyzed, showed a rapid descent followed by near immediate cessation of movement. Gabe's computer showed a brief dive, far shorter than those of others on the trip. These data points sharpened the focus on Gabe's role during the incident. Police took particular interest in Gabe's level of training. As a certified rescue diver, he was expected to respond to underwater emergencies. However, records indicated he had little practical experience in rescue situations and had completed the course only months prior. When asked, Gabe admitted he had never performed a real underwater rescue. Expert witnesses noted that several simple actions could have saved Tina's life. Inflating her buoyancy control device, removing her weight belt, or signaling the dive guide would have significantly increased her chances of survival. Instead, Gabe had surfaced without alerting others or attempting to assist beyond what he described as a short effort. One diver stated he saw Gabe looking down at Tina from a few meters above without taking further action. Dive guides and instructors who had worked with the couple earlier in the trip reported no overt problems, but some mentioned Tina appeared uncertain and relied heavily on Gabe. On at least one occasion, Tina had difficulty entering the water and appeared anxious. While not unusual for a new diver, these details gained significance in hindsight. Forensic analysis confirmed Tina's equipment was functional. Her BCD and regulator worked as intended. There was air remaining in her tank. Investigators began to eliminate mechanical failure as a contributing cause. In Alabama, Tina's family provided additional context. They described Tina as careful and conscientious. Emails and conversations revealed that she had reservations about certain aspects of the honeymoon, including the diving plan and Gabe's insistence on controlling logistics. She had reportedly refused to update one of her life insurance policies, despite Gabe's urging. The Queensland Coroner's Inquest, held in 2007, presented these findings in detail. The coroner found that while Tina's death may have appeared accidental, the surrounding circumstances suggested possible criminal negligence, or even intent. He recommended charges be considered. As the investigation closed in on a decision point, prosecutors debated whether Gabe's actions, his omissions and decisions during the dive, constituted manslaughter under Australian law. The matter would soon escalate from a coroner's recommendation to a formal criminal charge, triggering a new phase of legal scrutiny and international attention. In June 2008, nearly 5 years after Tina Watson's death, Australian authorities formally charged Gabe Watson with 1 count of manslaughter. The charge alleged that Watson, through gross negligence, failed to fulfill his responsibilities as a rescue-trained diver and husband during the fatal dive. Prosecutors argued that his failure to assist or alert others constituted criminal behavior under Queensland law. By this time, Watson had returned to his life in Alabama. After protracted negotiations between Australian and U.S. officials, he voluntarily agreed to return to Australia in 2009 to face the charge. His extradition was not compelled. Instead, it was framed as a cooperative gesture, although it was accompanied by legal counsel and strict conditions. Watson arrived in Brisbane and was quickly placed in custody pending court proceedings. The case drew extensive media coverage in both countries. Public interest was high, and debates over the complexity of international justice systems, differing legal standards, and the unusual nature of the charge filled news columns. Preliminary hearings laid out the core argument. Watson, as Tina's dive partner and a certified rescue diver, had a legal and moral duty to assist her in distress. Prosecutors argued that he abandoned her, failed to execute even basic rescue techniques, and surfaced without seeking help or ensuring her safety. Defense attorneys countered that Tina's inexperience and panic response made the situation unmanageable, and Watson acted within the bounds of personal safety. Faced with a potentially lengthy trial and legal uncertainties, Watson's legal team negotiated a plea deal. In June 2009, Gabe Watson pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter by failing to meet his duty of care. The plea avoided a full trial and was accepted by the court. In sentencing, the judge acknowledged the seriousness of the case but also considered the lack of prior criminal history and the legal complexities involved. Watson was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison, to be suspended after serving 12 months. This decision sparked outrage in both Australia and the United States, particularly among Tina's family, who viewed the sentence as inadequate. Tina's father issued public statements condemning the plea deal and called the sentence a miscarriage of justice. Australian lawmakers also voiced frustration over the outcome, though legal analysts noted that proving intent or higher culpability beyond negligence would have been a significant challenge in court. Watson served his prison term in Queensland's correctional system. He was released in November 2010 after completing the 18-month minimum portion of his sentence, including time served prior to conviction. He was then deported back to the United States. But legal battles surrounding Tina's death were far from over. Upon his return, a new set of charges awaited, this time from U.S. authorities. Gabe Watson's plea of guilty to manslaughter in Queensland marked a turning point in the case. While the plea spared him the uncertainty of a full trial, it left many questions unanswered. Under the terms of the deal, Watson admitted he failed in his duty to protect Tina during the dive but denied any intent to harm her. The charge did not require proof of motive or premeditation, only that he had acted recklessly or negligently. The sentencing drew immediate scrutiny. Justice Peter Dutney described Watson's actions as lacking in moral courage, but concluded they did not rise to the level of deliberate homicide. The court found no evidence of physical assault or tampering with equipment. Nevertheless, Watson's decision to abandon his wife underwater, given his training and the availability of assistance, formed the basis of his legal culpability. Public reaction in Australia was divided. Some accepted the plea as a pragmatic conclusion to a difficult case involving a foreign national and complex legal standards. Others viewed it as a failure to deliver justice, particularly in light of the perceived leniency of the sentence. Media outlets criticized the outcome, and the Queensland Attorney General faced pressure to appeal the sentence, though no changes were ultimately made. In Alabama, the response was more severe. Tina's family, especially her father, continued to insist that the Australian proceedings had not fully addressed their concerns. They pointed to Watson's behavior before and after the dive, his requests to change life insurance policies, his demeanor on the dive boat, and his actions following Tina's death, as suggestive of something more than negligence. Watson, upon completing his prison term, was escorted back to the United States under close monitoring. He returned to Birmingham, Alabama, where he was met with renewed scrutiny. Though he had completed his sentence in Australia, the state of Alabama had begun exploring the possibility of charging him under U.S. law for capital murder, arguing that aspects of the alleged crime had originated on American soil. The foundation for these charges rested on premeditation. Prosecutors claimed Watson had planned Tina's death in Alabama before carrying it out in Australia. While double jeopardy laws protected him from being tried twice for the same crime, the U.S. case hinged on the assertion that the Australian conviction did not cover the full scope of his alleged criminal conduct. In 2010, a grand jury in Jefferson County, Alabama, indicted Watson for capital murder. The charge alleged he plotted the killing in the United States and executed it abroad, a rare and complex legal theory. With Watson back on American soil, state prosecutors began preparing for a trial that would once again revisit the tragic events of October 2003, this time under a very different legal framework. Upon Gabe Watson's return to the United States in late 2010, the Alabama Attorney General's office moved quickly. Armed with a capital murder indictment from a Jefferson County grand jury, prosecutors alleged that Watson had planned Tina's death while in Alabama, thus placing the origin of the crime within U.S. jurisdiction. It was a bold legal strategy, one rarely used and even more rarely tested in court. The theory held that while the fatal act occurred in Australian waters, the planning, insurance arrangements, and alleged premeditation had begun months earlier in Birmingham. Investigators revisited details like Watson's efforts to modify insurance policies, his insistence on specific travel plans, and the couple's dynamics in the lead-up to their trip. These formed the basis of the state's argument that Watson's intent to kill had materialized before they ever boarded a flight. Prosecutors charged Watson under Alabama's capital murder statute, which allowed for charges if the intent to kill originated within the state, even if the act occurred elsewhere. To support their case, the prosecution built a narrative that extended beyond the dive itself. They highlighted Watson's attempts to make himself the sole beneficiary of Tina's life insurance, his push for expensive travel insurance, and statements he allegedly made to friends about handling emergency situations underwater. The defense quickly moved to dismiss the charges. They argued that the Australian conviction and sentencing already addressed the matter and that a second prosecution for the same incident, even if framed differently, violated legal protections against double jeopardy and due process. Legal scholars and international law experts closely followed the case. Questions about sovereignty, jurisdiction, and the reach of American criminal law dominated pre-trial hearings. Although the charges were technically distinct from those in Australia, they revolved around the same core event, the death of Tina Watson. In early 2012, a Jefferson County judge reviewed the motion to dismiss. After examining the record from Australia, including the plea agreement and sentencing documents, the court ruled that the state had not presented enough new or distinct evidence to justify a capital murder trial. The judge found that the prosecution's case substantially overlapped with the resolved Australian proceedings. The indictment was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. Watson was released from bond, and the Alabama case was formally closed. Though no U.S. conviction was secured, the episode underscored the legal and emotional complexities that had shadowed the case from the beginning. For Tina's family, the ruling marked a final legal setback. Having pursued justice through two national legal systems, they were left with an official conclusion that did not reflect their belief in the full scope of responsibility for Tina's death. Though the courtroom battle ended, the public discourse surrounding the case continued. In February 2012, the capital murder case against Gabe Watson proceeded to trial in Jefferson County, Alabama. The indictment accused Watson of planning Tina's death in the United States, providing the basis for jurisdiction despite the act occurring in Australian waters. Prosecutors entered court with the challenge of proving that Watson had orchestrated a murder during a honeymoon dive, disguising it as an accident. The courtroom was filled with observers, media representatives, and family members. For Tina's relatives, it was a long-awaited opportunity to see more evidence laid out in public. For the defense, it was a high-stakes challenge to rebut a narrative that had evolved over nearly a decade. The prosecution presented witness statements, past insurance requests, and behavioral accounts to support the theory of premeditation. Testimony included dive experts and forensic analysts who explained standard rescue protocols and Tina's inexperience. Friends of Tina recounted conversations where she expressed unease about Watson's controlling behavior and anxiety about the dive trip. Insurance documents showed attempts to increase policy values and alter beneficiaries shortly before the honeymoon. However, the defense highlighted gaps in the prosecution's timeline and logic. They contended that the Australian legal process had already addressed the incident appropriately and that the current case was an attempt to retry Watson under a different label. They challenged the credibility of motive, pointing out that no insurance payout had ever been made and that Tina had not followed through on changing the policy in Watson's favor. They also emphasized that Watson had been trained as a rescue diver but had little actual rescue experience. In cross-examinations, defense attorneys pressed witnesses on the limitations of their knowledge, including assumptions about underwater panic responses and interpretations of dive computer data. Perhaps most critically, the defense argued there was no direct evidence of murder. There were no witnesses to an act of violence, no proof of sabotage, and no forensic findings that confirmed an intentional killing. The entire case, they asserted, rested on circumstantial evidence and speculation about Watson's state of mind. After several days of testimony and arguments, the judge determined that the prosecution had not met the burden required to send the case to a jury. The charge of capital murder was dismissed, and Watson was acquitted. He left the courtroom a free man, having faced and defeated both an Australian manslaughter conviction and an American murder charge. The decision left Tina's family disheartened. Public reaction was divided, with some viewing the trial as necessary closure and others seeing it as an overreach of legal authority. For Gabe Watson, the legal process had come to an end, but public opinion remained sharply divided. The acquittal of Gabe Watson in the Alabama trial marked the conclusion of nearly a decade of legal proceedings spanning 2 continents. Although no further charges could be brought, public interest in the case remained high. Tina Watson's death, once considered a tragic diving accident, had transformed into a case study in international justice, media scrutiny, and the limits of legal systems to resolve complex emotional narratives. In Australia, questions continued to be raised about the adequacy of the manslaughter sentence. Some officials expressed regret that a full trial had been avoided, arguing that a jury should have assessed the weight of the evidence. The plea deal, while legally valid, had left many observers with a sense of incompletion. In Queensland, policy discussions were initiated about how to better protect tourists engaging in high-risk activities like diving, particularly those with limited experience. In Alabama, Tina's parents maintained their belief that justice had not been served. They continued to speak publicly, sharing Tina's story and advocating for improved oversight in both travel safety and international criminal cooperation. Their persistence kept the case in public conversation, with appearances in news features, documentaries, and legal retrospectives. For Gabe Watson, life after the trials was quieter but still under public gaze. He returned to a private life in Alabama, attempting to move forward after years of legal entanglement. Although never convicted of murder, the case had permanently shaped his public image. Media references to the honeymoon killer followed him, and any attempt at anonymity was complicated by the widespread coverage and archival presence of the case online. The diving industry also responded. Operators in Australia and elsewhere reevaluated their policies regarding unguided dives, especially for newly certified divers. The incident served as a cautionary tale, reinforcing the importance of matching dive conditions to participants' skill levels and ensuring that buddy systems were not merely formalities. In academic and legal circles, the case became a subject of debate. It raised issues about jurisdictional overlap, the definition of negligence versus intent, and the interplay between public opinion and prosecutorial decision-making. Legal scholars examined the strategy used in Alabama and questioned whether similar cases could, or should, be pursued under such legal theories. Tina Watson was remembered not only as a victim of a diving accident but as a symbol of enduring questions about accountability and the human tendency to seek meaning in tragedy. Her family continued to honor her memory through community work and speaking engagements. Her story, tragic and unresolved in the eyes of many, left a legacy that extended beyond any courtroom verdict.